She had spent 12 years making herself invisible in that house, and it took a stranger 30 seconds to see her. When Cade Ashford rode into the Hale property to choose a bride, every soul in that parlor knew who he'd pick. Elena was perfect. Elena was prepared. Elena had been groomed for this single moment since the day she was old enough to understand what a desperate family needed from a beautiful daughter. But when Cade's eyes moved past Elena, past the cream dress, the practiced smile, the pearl earrings, and settled on the Chinese woman standing silent in the corner shadows, the room didn't just go quiet, it went cold. Gerald Hale's face twisted. Constance's breath stopped. Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides. And Meen, whose hands were raw from 2 days of scrubbing floors no one would ever notice were clean, felt her whole body begin to shake. Because in that one impossible moment, a man she had never met looked at her like she was worth looking at. And everything fell apart. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The Montana Territory did not care about human suffering. That was the first thing Meen had understood when her mother brought her here at the age of 12. Not the cold, not the distances, not the way the wind came down off the mountains like something with a grudge. What she understood was the indifference. The land stretched in every direction under a late September sky, so vast and gold it hurt to look at, and it asked nothing of the people trying to carve lives into it. It did not reward effort. It did not punish cruelty. It simply continued massive and unhurried while small human dramas played out in the dust at its feet. The Hale Ranch sat small against that vastness. It had always sat small even in the years when Gerald Hale still had something to be proud of. The white paint was peeling in long curling strips, now the fences sagging, the corrals empty of everything except wind and memory. Meen had grown up watching this place diminish, had watched it the way you watch a person age in increments, so gradual. You only noticed when you looked at an old photograph and felt the shock of comparison. Inside, everything that could be made to shine had been polished until it hurt. Meen's hands ached from it. She'd spent the past 2 days on her knees working lye soap into floorboards that had absorbed 20 years of Montana dirt and would never be truly clean, not down in the grain where it counted. Her fingers were raw, the skin around her nails cracked and stinging. But she kept them tucked into her sleeves now, hidden. On a day like today, everything about her was meant to be hidden. "Stand there," Gerald had told her that morning, pointing to the corner near the kitchen door without looking at her. He never looked at her if he could avoid it. "Out of the way. If he asks about you, I'll explain that you help with the household." Help with the household. 12 years. 12 years of rising before dawn and sleeping after midnight, of meals cooked and floors scrubbed and ledgers balanced and gardens coaxed and mending done by lamplight until her eyes ached. 12 years of making herself useful in every way a person could be useful, and her entire existence in this house reduced to 8 words. She helps around the house. Meen stood in her corner and kept her face calm and watched Elena take her position in the center of the parlor. Elena was 19 and beautiful in the way frontier men expected women to be. Beautiful, strong-featured, clear-eyed, with the kind of capable handsomeness that promised she could run a household through a hard winter and still set a decent table. She wore their mother's pearl earrings and a cream-colored dress that had been altered 3 times to fit her perfectly. Her dark hair was arranged in careful curls. Her posture was straight but not stiff, welcoming but not eager. She had been coached for weeks. Remember to smile, but not too broadly. Constance had instructed, fussing over her just that morning. Ask him about his ranch, but don't seem too interested in the details. Men like to explain things. Let him feel intelligent. Elena had absorbed every lesson with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly how much was riding on this afternoon. She stood now in the center of that carefully arranged light, and she was everything the Ashford family was supposed to want. Meen's own dress was a simple gray cotton, plain as dishwater. Her hair was pulled back in a single braid. No one had bothered to coach her. No one expected her to speak. The sound of horses reached them through the open window. 3 riders coming up the long road from town. Gerald moved to the window, his shoulders tightening beneath his Sunday coat. He was a compact, weather-sharpened man who had spent his whole life calculating odds and making small, desperate bets against an indifferent universe. This was his largest gamble, yet his most important card played against debts that had been accumulating for years, with the Ashford family debts that everyone in the territory knew about and no one ever discussed directly. Remember, Gerald said, not turning from the window, his voice low and controlled. The Ashfords are the most powerful family in the territory. This marriage secures our future. Everything depends on making the right impression. He didn't look at Meen when he said it. He never did. Constance stepped back from Elena, examining her work with the critical eye of a craftsman assessing a finished piece. Perfect, she breathed. You're absolutely perfect. Elena's hands trembled slightly. She clasped them together, hiding it. The trembling wasn't fear exactly. It was the physical manifestation of years of preparation finally arriving at their purpose. She had been raised for this moment, shaped and polished and aimed at it. Whether that was love or something more ruthless, Meen had never been entirely sure. She watched from her corner and felt the complicated mixture of emotions she always felt when she looked at Elena. Pity and relief, and something harder to name. Relief that she had been spared such careful grooming. Pity that Elena couldn't see how the grooming had changed her into something that performed personhood rather than lived it. Better to be ignored than shaped into something false. The horses drew closer. Meen could hear the creak of saddle leather now, the low voices of men comfortable with their own authority. Her heart beat faster despite her best efforts. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs through the cotton of her dress and made herself breathe slowly. The knock came firm, unhurried, the knock of a man who had never needed to wonder whether a door would be opened to him. Gerald smoothed his vest, checked his collar, arranged his face into an expression of dignified welcome, and opened the door. Cade Ashford stepped into the Hale house like he owned it, which Meen supposed he very nearly did. He was taller than she'd expected, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow. He wore range clothes, dusty boots, worn denim, a shirt that had clearly seen honest work. But there was something in the way he carried himself that spoke of education, of choices made from a position of actual freedom, of a life lived with genuine options. He was perhaps 30, old enough to have run cattle through hard winters, young enough that he hadn't yet developed the permanent squint of men who had spent decades staring at horizons trying to read the weather. Behind him came two others. One was a ranch hand, older and weathered, who stationed himself near the door with the practiced ease of someone who understood his role and had no ambitions beyond it. The other was Gideon Ashford, and Gideon Ashford was a different kind of man entirely. He was perhaps 60, still powerful in build, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that took in everything and gave back nothing. He wore a suit despite the afternoon heat, despite the dust of a long ride, and somehow looked perfectly comfortable in it, the way a man looks comfortable in armor he has worn so long it has become a second skin. He moved into the Hale parlor, and the room seemed to reorganize itself slightly around his presence, the way furniture shifts when a large piece is added. This was a man who had built an empire in country that broke lesser men, and he wore that fact like a coat. Mr. Hale, Gideon's voice carried the rough edges of the frontier, but his words were precise and measured. Thank you for receiving us. Mr. Ashford, Gerald shook hands, his grip firm, but carefully calibrated, not challenging, not submissive. And Cade, please come in. May I introduce my family? The introductions followed the expected pattern. Constance, smiling and gracious. Elena, who executed a perfect curtsy and offered exactly the right blend of modesty and interest, asking Cade a small question about the ride from town that made him feel the courtesy of being asked without making him feel examined. The Ashford men were polite and attentive and gave away nothing at all. Then Gerald's hand gestured vaguely toward Meen's corner. And this, he said with the particular inflection of a man acknowledging furniture, is Meen. She helps around the house. That was it. 12 years, 8 words. Meen inclined her head slightly and kept her eyes lowered and played the part that had been assigned to her from the first morning she had woken up in this house and understood what she was to them. She was practiced at it. She had been practicing for 12 years. But something changed in the room. She felt it before she could name it, a shift in the quality of attention, like wind changing direction before a storm. And when she glanced up, following the instinct she hadn't learned to suppress quickly enough, she found Cade Ashford looking directly at her. Not the dismissive assessment men usually gave her, the quick catalog of her features, her skin, her foreignness, the silent judgment of exotic or wrong before they turned back to the room's more relevant occupants. Not that. This was different. He was looking at her the way you look at something you recognize unexpectedly, with a focus that was almost startled, as if he had come into a room expecting one thing and found another entirely. The moment stretched. Meen's breath caught in her throat. She didn't look away, couldn't look away, held by something in his gaze that she didn't have a name for, something that felt uncomfortably close to being seen, actually seen in a way she had trained herself not to hope for. Then Gideon cleared his throat and the spell broke, and Meen retreated behind her eyes in her corner in the careful blankness of her expression. "Perhaps we might sit," Gerald suggested, moving toward the parlor chairs with the slightly desperate energy of a man trying to regain control of a situation he hadn't realized he'd lost. "Meen," Constance said, already turning away. "Bring coffee." She moved immediately, grateful for the escape, grateful for the familiar mechanics of something to do with her hands. The kitchen was just through the doorway, close enough to hear the conversation, far enough to pretend she wasn't part of it. Her hands shook as she poured coffee from the pot she'd kept warm all morning. The cups rattled against their saucers. She set them down, breathed slowly, forced the trembling to stop. "It means nothing," she told herself firmly. "He looked at you for a moment. Men look at you sometimes. It never means anything good." Through the doorway, she could see the parlor, Elena sitting straight-backed in her chair, her hands folded perfectly in her lap, her expression pleasant and engaged. Constance pouring more coffee, maintaining the performance of gracious hospitality, with the focused determination of a woman who understood that the family's future balanced on the next hour. "Elena has been managing the household for several years," Constance was saying. "She's very capable, good with numbers, good with people. She's learned to manage quite well in difficult circumstances." Translation, Meen thought, arranging cups on a tray with automatic precision. She can make poverty look like a choice. She can make deprivation look like elegance. Those were useful skills for a frontier wife. That was what was being offered here, not a daughter, but a capacity. Not a person, but a function. Gideon asked about water rights, about winter feed stores, about the political situation in Helena. Gerald answered with the careful optimism of a man trying to make debt look like opportunity, trying to make a failing ranch look like a going concern. Elena contributed small observations perfectly timed, demonstrating intelligence without appearing to challenge anyone's authority in the room. Meen carried the tray in. She moved quietly, serving Gideon first, always the patriarch, then Gerald, then Cade. When she leaned forward to set his cup on the side table beside his chair, she felt his attention again. That same focused weight. She did not let her hands shake this time. "Thank you," he said quietly. Just 2 words. She met his eyes for just a second. Propriety permitted that much, barely, and stepped back. His expression was still unreadable, still giving nothing away. But something in it made her pulse quicken in a way she did not want to examine. She retreated to her corner, eyes down, hands clasped, invisible again. The conversation continued, business dressed in the clothes of pleasantry, the mechanics of a transaction that everyone in the room understood, and no one would name directly. Meen stood and watched and understood exactly what was happening. Elena was the commodity. The Ashfords were the buyers. Gerald was the desperate seller trying to make his goods look more valuable than the asking price revealed. If the deal concluded successfully, Elena would go to the Ashford ranch as Cade's wife. The Hale family debts would be forgiven. Gerald would keep his land for another season. Everyone would move forward. If it didn't, the Hales would lose the ranch before spring. Everyone in that room knew it. No one said so. After perhaps an hour of careful conversation, Gideon set down his coffee cup with the deliberate precision of a man concluding a preliminary meeting. "Perhaps," he said in a tone that was a command, shaped like a suggestion, "Cade might walk outside with Miss Elena, see a bit of the property, get to know each other." Gerald was on his feet before the sentence finished. "Of course. Elena, why don't you show Mr. Ashford the garden?" Elena rose smooth and practiced her movement, a small masterwork of everything she'd been trained to do. Graceful, not showy, available, not eager. Cade stood as well, offering his arm with correct formality. They moved toward the door, and at the threshold, Cade stopped. He turned back. Not toward Elena, not toward Gideon, not toward Gerald. He looked directly at Meen. "Perhaps," he said, his voice mild, his tone carrying that same quiet iron she'd heard underneath the courtesy earlier. "Both young ladies might join us. I'd like to see more of the household." The room went absolutely still. Gerald's smile held in place by what appeared to be pure will. "Meen has work to attend to. I'm sure Elena can..." I'd appreciate it, Cade said. Simple, final. It's not too much trouble, hung unspoken in the air because the Hale family could not afford to let it be too much trouble. Of course. Gerald's voice was controlled so tightly it was almost without inflection. Meen, join them. Every eye in the parlor turned toward her corner. Gerald's gaze carried a warning she could read as clearly as print. Do not ruin this. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not let whatever you are get in the way of what I need. Constance looked bewildered. Her careful choreography suddenly disrupted. Elena's expression had frozen into something that was still technically a smile, but was doing entirely different work, holding in something that looked like fury. Gideon watched all of this with the cool, comprehensive attention of a man cataloging information. Meen's legs felt uncertain as she walked across the room. No one had ever asked for her company before. Not like this, not as a social gesture, not as courtesy, not as anything except additional labor to be deployed. Elena stood at the door, Cade's arm already extended to her. Now he offered his other arm to Meen. She stopped. No man had ever offered her his arm. Not in courtesy, not in public, not once in 12 years of living in this house and moving through this territory where she was at best invisible and at worst the subject of casual hostility. She was the Chinese woman, the outsider, the one who served. Men did not treat her like a lady. Miss Meen, Cade said, his voice gentling slightly. She placed her hand on his sleeve. She felt the solid warmth of him beneath the fabric, the realness of it, the extraordinary ordinariness of a simple, courteous gesture, and let him lead her out through the front door into the September afternoon light. Elena's fury was silent but absolute. Meen could feel it radiating from her sister's body like heat from a stove, could see it in the rigid line of her shoulders, in the frozen quality of her smile, and the way her hand had tightened on Cade's arm just a fraction too much. But she couldn't say anything, couldn't protest or redirect or reclaim the situation, not with Cade Ashford standing right there, and the entire future of the Hale family balanced on his goodwill. They walked toward the garden, such as it was. Constance had tried to maintain it, but water was scarce, and time scarcer, and the result was more honest than beautiful. A few stubborn roses clung to the fence with the grim determination of things that hadn't been informed they were supposed to have given up. Some herbs in a kitchen plot, vegetables that looked resigned rather than thriving. Your father mentioned you help with the household, Cade said, glancing at Meen. What does that involve? It was a simple question. It felt like the edge of something. Elena moved to answer before Meen could draw a breath. Meen is very helpful with the cooking and the cleaning. She has a real talent for making things stretch, very useful in difficult times. The words were technically complimentary and carried the weight of a door being firmly closed. She is a servant, a capable one, nothing more. I asked Miss Meen, Cade said. The words were quiet. The effect was not. Meen's mouth had gone dry. She had spent years, all her years in this house, perfecting the art of deflection, of making herself smaller than she was, of answering questions with answers that gave nothing away and asked for nothing in return. It was survival. It was habit. It was the only kind of safety available to her. I help where I'm needed, she said finally. Her voice was quieter than she would have liked. Cooking, cleaning, mending the garden, whatever is required. And before this, Cade said, your family came from where? San Francisco. The word felt strange in her mouth here in this landscape that had nothing of the city in it. My mother brought me here when I was 12. She was a seamstress. She paused, calculating. After she died, Mr. Hale, my mother, had married him when I was young. I stayed on to help the family. The cleaned version, the version with the sharp edges filed smooth. The truth was harder. Her mother had been dying, desperate, had married Gerald Hale because he'd promised to care for her daughter. He had kept that promise in the most minimal possible sense. Shelter, food, work, nothing more. I see, Cade said. His tone suggested he saw considerably more than she had said. They walked in silence for a moment. Elena made several attempts to redirect the conversation, pointing out the roses with a narrative about resilience, describing the kitchen garden with the kind of careful spin that made necessity sound like virtue. She was good at it, genuinely impressively good at taking nothing and making it sound like something. It was what she'd been trained to do. But Cade kept looking at Meen. What do you think of the territory, he asked her. Montana, do you like it here? Another trap, she thought. Or maybe not a trap, maybe just a question. Maybe the idea felt almost dangerously foreign. He actually wanted to know. She had never been asked what she liked, not once. Her preferences were irrelevant to everyone in her life, had been for so long that she'd stopped having them in any conscious way, had learned to want only what was available and be grateful for that much. But Cade was waiting, genuinely waiting with the particular stillness of someone who intended to listen to the answer. "It's hard country," she said at last. The words came out before she could stop them. "But honest, it doesn't pretend to be something it's not." She heard Elena's hand tighten on Cade's arm. She felt the small shock of her own honesty, too much, too close to things she wasn't supposed to say in front of strangers who held the family's future in their hands. Cade smiled. It was a small expression, barely there and gone. But she saw it. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." They walked back toward the house. Gideon and Gerald had moved to the porch deep in conversation that clearly involved numbers and agreements and the invisible machinery of how debt became deal. When they saw the three approaching, they separated with the practiced ease of men transitioning between negotiations. "Well," Gideon said to his son, "what do you think of the property?" Cade helped both women up the porch steps before he answered. It was a small courtesy, a frontier formality, the kind of gesture that could be read as nothing more than manners. But Meen noticed it. She noticed the deliberateness of it, that he helped her up first. "I think," Cade said slowly, his eyes moving between Gideon and Gerald, "that I'd like to speak with Mr. Hale privately." Elena's breath caught. Hope, bright and desperate, transformed her face for one unguarded moment. This was it. This was the moment she had been preparing for her entire conscious life. Gerald nearly stumbled over himself, agreeing. Of course, of course. Please come into my study. We can discuss whatever you need." The men filed inside. Constance appeared in the doorway, her face alight with barely suppressed triumph, already calculating what came next. "Girls, come inside. Give them privacy." Elena moved immediately, already inhabiting her imagined future. Meen stayed on the porch, just for a moment, just long enough to look out at the Montana landscape, the mountains going amber and rose with the approaching sunset, the vast sky turning colors. She had no names for the distance that just kept going and going without end. This is what her life would be now, watching from the edges while Elena stepped into the future Gerald had spent years building. Watching while the debt was forgiven and the family was saved and everyone moved forward into lives that had places in them for the people who mattered. She should be grateful. She knew she should be grateful. If Elena married well, the household would be more stable. There would be less want, less desperation, possibly even a small allowance that might eventually accumulate into something resembling a future of her own. It was more than she had ever had reason to expect. But standing there in the fading light with the mountains going gold around her, Meen let herself feel the truth she had spent 12 years learning to suppress. The truth she kept locked in a room inside herself that she never opened because there was no point in opening it. She was tired. She was so profoundly bone-deep tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of living at the edges of other people's plans, useful only as labor, acknowledged only as function. Tired of standing in corners while other people's lives happened around her. Tired of having been born with the same capacity for wanting things real, things, human things, as anyone else in that parlor, and having been taught so thoroughly to want nothing. "Meen?" Constance's voice sharp and impatient from just inside the door. "Come inside. Now." Meen turned and obeyed. She always obeyed. Inside, the wait had begun. Elena paced the parlor with barely contained energy, while Constance hissed at her to sit down and look serene. "What's taking so long?" Elena demanded, her voice low and tight. "What are they talking about?" "Business," Constance said. "Sit down." Meen moved to the kitchen, began clearing coffee cups. Let the familiar mechanics of work keep her hands busy. Through the wall, she could hear the low register of male voices. Not the words, just the sound of men negotiating the particulars of a transaction. The price of a daughter. The terms of a debt forgiven. 10 minutes. 15. Meen washed cups, dried them, placed them in the cabinet with the automatic precision of someone who had done this particular sequence 10,000 times. She was not thinking about anything. She had made herself not think. The study door opened. The men emerged in a particular formation that told a story before anyone spoke. Gerald in front, his face caught between expressions. Meen couldn't quite parse something that moved between rage and calculation, and a dazed, disbelieving quality she had never seen on him before. Gideon behind him wearing the settled satisfaction of a man who had concluded a meeting on his terms. And Cade's expression was calm, resolve, certain, the expression of a man who had made a decision and would not be moved from it. Elena rushed forward, radiant, every bit of her preparation concentrated into this one moment. Her face was a landscape of anticipated triumph. "Well," Gerald said. His voice was strange, strained, almost strangled. "It seems we have an understanding." "That's wonderful." Constance breathed, her hands coming together. "That's—" "Mr. Ashford has made his choice." Gerald's eyes found Meen across the kitchen doorway. There was something terrible in them, rage barely leashed disbelief, and underneath both of those things something that looked almost like shame, though she had never seen that on him before either. "He has asked to marry Meen." The sentence made no sense. Meen heard each word separately, understood each one on its own, but assembled together into this meaning they formed something her mind refused to accept. She stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel still in her hands and felt the room turn strange around her. Elena made a sound as if she'd been struck. "That's impossible." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "That's father, that's not, she's not even—" "The decision has been made." Gideon's voice came across the room like a door closing. Final. Unappealable. Cade has chosen his bride. The terms have been discussed and agreed upon. The arrangement is acceptable to all parties. All parties? Elena's voice broke on the last word, cracked open by something too large to contain. "You cannot be serious. She's not—" She stopped herself, but everyone in the room heard the rest of it in the silence. "She's not even family. Not really. Not in the way that matters." Meen still hadn't moved. Her mind was running through it in circles, searching for the version of events where this made sense, where a man like Cade Ashford who could have had Elena, who could have had any number of proper frontier daughters with connections and land, and the right kind of name, chose instead the Chinese woman who helped with the household. The woman who stood in corners. The woman who wasn't supposed to matter. "Meen," Gerald's voice stripped down to its most controlled tone. "Come here." She moved on legs that felt disconnected from the rest of her across the parlor, while her mind continued its useless spinning. When she reached Gerald's side, his hand closed around her arm, tight enough to bruise, tight enough to leave marks she would find tomorrow, with something between recognition and resignation. "Mr. Ashford has made you a very generous offer." Each word fell separately like stones. "You should be grateful." She looked at Elena. Elena, whose face was wet with tears she was no longer trying to hide, whose whole body had collapsed slightly, as if the architecture of her expectations had given way all at once. Elena, who had spent 19 years being shaped into an offering that had just been declined. She looked at Constance, who had gone the color of old wax. She looked at Gerald, whose desperation was curdling into fury in real time. Then she looked at Cade. He was watching her with the same focused, quiet attention he'd been giving her since he walked into the house. Not triumphant, not demanding, just present, waiting, as if her answer actually mattered, as if she was a person who had a real choice here, as if this moment belonged to her in some way she had never been given a moment to belong to before. "Miss Meen," his voice was low, meant for her. "I know this is sudden. If you need time to—" "She accepts." Gerald's grip on her arm tightened. "Of course she accepts. Don't you mean—" "Not a question, a command. Accept this. Fix what your existence has broken. Make this right." Meen looked at her sister's devastated face, looked at the ruins of a plan that had been years in the making, looked at the man who had walked into this house and seen her in a way she hadn't been seen since her mother was alive, and made a choice that confused and frightened, and underneath both of those things offers her something she had trained herself not to want. Maybe it's trading one cage for another, she thought. Maybe his reasons are as calculating as everyone else's. Maybe this is worse. Maybe you're riding toward something worse. But Gerald's fingers were digging into her arm, and Elena's sobs were filling the room, and 12 years of standing in corners pressed down on her like the whole weight of the Montana sky. "Yes," she said. Her voice was quiet. Her voice was steady. "I accept." The room exploded. Elena turned and ran her footsteps on the stairs, a rapid, broken rhythm. Constance called after her and followed. Gerald's grip on Meen's arm tightened viciously for one moment before he released her. She could feel the shape of his fingers already printing themselves into her skin, and his face contorted with a rage he couldn't express in front of the Ashfords without destroying the agreement he'd just made. Only Gideon remained unmoved. He watched the chaos with the detached attention of a man observing weather. "Excellent," he said. "We'll arrange for the ceremony to take place in 3 days. That should give everyone time to prepare." He looked at Meen with eyes that held no warmth whatsoever, nothing but the cold precision of assessment. "Cade will return then to collect his bride. 3 days, 72 hours, before everything changed forever." Gerald pulled himself together enough to shake hands to receive Gideon's congratulations with something resembling grace to show them out with the mechanical dignity of a man walking through a play he hadn't agreed to be in. His smile never reached his eyes. His eyes never stopped calculating. At the door, Cade paused. He turned back to Meen, standing in the center of the devastated parlor with her dish towel still clutched in her hands. "Miss Meen," he said, "I'll see you in 3 days." She nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. He held her gaze for a long moment, long enough that she felt something again in it, that quality of trying to tell her something, trying to reassure her, trying to make her understand that this wasn't what it looked like. Or maybe it was exactly what it looked like, and he was simply making sure she knew he wasn't ashamed of it. Then the Ashfords were gone, riding back toward town in the deepening twilight, and the dust of their horses settled, and Meen was left alone in the ruined parlor. From the study, the slam of Gerald's door. From upstairs, the broken sounds of Elena's crying muffled through floorboards. Meen stood very still in the gathering dark and tried to understand what she had done. Part of her wanted to go upstairs, to knock on Elena's door to say something that might begin to close the distance that Cade's choice had torn open. But she knew with the clear-eyed precision she'd developed in 12 years of reading this family's silences that there was nothing to say. Not tonight, maybe not ever. And there was another truth she had to sit with in the quiet she had wanted it. Standing in that parlor with Cade's attention on her like light after years of shadow, she had wanted to be chosen. Had wanted to matter even knowing what it would cost, even knowing it would break something that couldn't be repaired. That was its own kind of answer. The next 3 days moved through the Hale house like weather cold, heavy, unavoidable. Elena emerged only for meals which she ate in rigid silence before retreating. Constance moved through her routines with the blunted automatism of a woman who had suffered a shock and not yet processed it. Gerald's silence was its own form of violence, filling every room he entered. No one spoke to Meen except to give her work to do. She kept going. It was what she knew how to do. On the second day, Constance appeared in the kitchen doorway while Meen was kneading bread and stood there for a moment with the particular look of a woman waging an internal argument. "You'll need a dress," she said finally. Blunt. No preamble. "Something appropriate. You can't be married in that." "I don't have anything else," Meen said. Constance's jaw tightened. "I know." She left and returned a few minutes later, carrying something wrapped in old muslin. When she unfolded it, Meen saw ivory silk, fine and slightly yellowed with age, the craftsmanship still visible, even under the years. "This was mine," Constance said, "from when I married your father." A pause. The word father sat between them, imprecise and uncomfortable, and neither of them acknowledged it. "It won't fit perfectly, but it's better than nothing." There was no kindness in Constance's face. She was performing necessity, dressing Meen the way she might prepare an animal for market, making sure the presentation was adequate. Not because she cared about Meen, but because her own dignity was somehow bound up in what Meen wore when she left this house. "Thank you," Meen said quietly. Constance nodded once, sharp as a period. "We'll alter it tomorrow. Try not to ruin it before then." Alone in her small room, under the eaves that night, holding the dress, Meen thought about Constance coming to this house wearing this silk full of plans and hope. She thought about what 12 years in Gerald Hale's orbit did to hope. She thought about the question she couldn't answer. Was she riding toward the same thing? She packed her few possessions slowly. A single bag, some clothes, her mother's hairbrush, a small wooden box containing the only letter her mother had ever written her, not mailed, because there was no one to mail it to, but written in the last weeks of her illness, tucked into the box for Meen to find after. The letter was in Cantonese, and Meen had read it so many times she had memorized it, though she never said the words aloud. Her entire life fit in one bag. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to Elena cry through the wall, and thought about freedom, about what it meant, whether it was real, whether the thing being offered to her was freedom, or just a different kind of invisible room. But maybe she thought in the quiet dark with the Montana wind pressing against the window. Maybe not disappearing anymore would be enough to start with. The morning of the third day arrived clear and cold. Meen woke before dawn as always and moved through the house in the dark, starting the stove, starting the coffee, starting the bread that would be ready when the household woke. It was what she did. It was what she had always done, even today, even now. At noon, Constance called her upstairs for the fitting. She worked in silence, pinning and tucking the ivory silk until it hung on Meen's frame with something approaching grace. The seed pearls at the collar, the delicate lace at the cuffs. Meen stood in front of the spotted mirror and did not recognize the woman looking back. There, Constance said, stepping back to assess. It will do. The highest praise available. At 2 o'clock, the Ashfords arrived. No ranch hand this time. Just Cade and Gideon, and behind them a thin man in a dusty black coat who had the look of someone who had spent too many years in the saddle riding between settlements, performing the rituals of frontier life. The marriages, the funerals, the occasional baptism in a creek too cold for comfort. Meen stood in her room wearing Constance's ivory dress, her hair in a simple twist at the base of her neck, and listened to the sounds of arrival below Gerald's voice. Gideon's the creak of the front door. Constance knocked once and opened the door without waiting. They're waiting, she said. Then after a pause long enough to suggest the words cost her something, you look acceptable. It was the kindest thing she had said in 3 days. The parlor had been cleared, chairs moved to space made in front of the fireplace. The preacher stood there with his worn book. Gideon to one side unreadable. Gerald and Constance in their positions performing the roles of family for an audience of one. Elena was nowhere. And Cade waited at the center of it, wearing a clean shirt and a dark vest, his hair combed back, his expression serious but not cold. When Meen came down the stairs and into the parlor, his eyes found her immediately. That same focused attention, that same quality of seeing. She walked toward him on legs that felt uncertain. No one gave her away. No one held her hand or murmured encouragement or walked beside her. She crossed the room alone, as she had crossed every room in this house for 12 years. But this time when she reached his side, Cade offered her his hand. She took it. His grip was warm and steady and real. The preacher spoke. The words moved through the air above Meen's head, formal and ritualized, and only partly landing. Her attention was focused on the weight of Cade's hand holding hers, on the extraordinary reality of what was happening. Do you, Cade Ashford, take this woman? I do. His voice was clear, certain, no hesitation. Do you mean Hale, take this man? This was the last moment. The final opportunity to step back, to refuse to choose the familiar misery over the unknown one. To stay in the corner she knew rather than walk toward a door she couldn't see through. Meen thought of 12 years of lye soap, of standing in corners, of hands raw from work no one acknowledged, of existing in a house, as labor as function, as the minimum obligation that Gerald Hale had agreed to when he married a dying woman and promised to care for her daughter. She looked at Cade and saw a man who had walked into this house and looked at her, really looked, and made a choice that cost him something. She didn't know yet what it would mean. She didn't know if she could trust it. She didn't know anything except that she was tired of disappearing. I do, she said. The preacher smiled, thin and weathered. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you man and wife. Cade leaned down, his hand gentle on her cheek, and kissed her. It was brief, correct, appropriate to the witnesses. But Meen felt it like a current through still water, like the shock of something real in a life that had been made so carefully unreal. When he pulled back, there was something in his expression that looked almost like relief, as if he too had been holding his breath. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Ashford, Gideon said. His voice was formal, correct, empty of warmth, but he extended his hand, and when Meen took it, he did not pull away. Gerald offered congratulations with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Constance nodded stiffly. The preacher collected his fee and was gone. And just like that, in a parlor with no flowers and no music, and no one in the room who was entirely glad about what had just happened, Meen Hale became Meen Ashford. We should go, Gideon said. It's a long ride. We'll want to arrive before dark. Upstairs, she and Cade gathered her single bag in silence. At the door of her small room, Meen paused and looked at it one last time, the narrow bed, the single chair, the battered dresser, the whole Spartan geometry of a life kept deliberately small. The room of someone who had never been meant to matter. Get what you want to keep, Cade said quietly. Whatever has value. Don't leave anything you'll regret. She was already done. Everything was already packed. Elena appeared in the hallway as they came out. Her face blotched and hard, her eyes red and furious with the specific fury of someone who has run out of tears but not out of grief. You must be very proud of yourself, she said. Her voice shook. You've ruined everything. Everything I worked for. Everything I was promised. Meen opened her mouth, closed it. What was there to say? Elena. Cade's voice was gentle, but its gentleness had iron in it. Your sister didn't choose this. I did. Why Elena turned on him, the word torn out of her. Why her? I'm the one who was prepared. I'm the one who learned, who studied, who made myself into what a man like you needs. Her gesture toward Meen was helpless, encompassing. She's nobody. She's not even really part of this family. That's enough. 2 words, the iron fully visible now. Elena flinched. Her face crumpled, the fury collapsing into something raw underneath. It's not fair, she whispered. It's not fair. She turned and disappeared into her room. The door closed. Meen stood in the hallway with the echo of those words. She's nobody, moving through her chest like weather. Cade's words moved through her too. I chose this. I chose her. But he hadn't answered Elena's question. He hadn't said why. Ready? He asked, picking up her bag as if it weighed nothing. No, she wasn't. She might never be. Yes, she said. Downstairs, Gerald waited by the front door alone. Constance had made herself scarce, which might have been mercy or might have been inability to watch. Gerald stood in his Sunday coat with the look of a man who had made a transaction he needed to believe was acceptable and was not yet succeeding. Well, he said. His voice was cold, controlled. The voice of a man who was choosing his words with great care because the alternative was saying something in front of a witness he couldn't unsay. I suppose this is farewell. He was speaking to Meen, or he was speaking toward her, which was the closest he usually got. Thank you, she said. The words came out before she had fully decided to say them. For taking care of me after my mother died. Something moved across his face there and gone quick as a fish below water. Something that might have been shame. Then it was gone and his expression was closed again. Send word if there are any problems, he said to Cade. Not to Meen, final to the last. Cade's hands settled on the small of her back, warm and solid. There won't be any problems, he said. Goodbye, Mr. Hale. They walked out together. Outside, 3 horses waited in the late afternoon light, 2 saddled, 1 packed with supplies. Gideon already mounted, watching with that calculating expression that made Meen's skin prickle. Have you ridden much? Cade asked her. Some, she said, when I was younger. You'll ride with me. He swung into the saddle and reached down, and she took his hand, and he pulled her up in front of him with an ease that suggested he had done this kind of thing before. She settled against him, his arms coming around her to hold the reins, his chest solid at her back, his warmth surrounding her in the cool afternoon. Comfortable? He asked, his voice close to her ear. She nodded. Gideon kicked his horse forward. Cade followed. And Cade Ashford, for that was who she was now. That was the name she had accepted. Rode away from the only home she had ever known. Away from the corner where she had learned to disappear. Away from the small room under the eaves and the cracked hands in the 12 years of someone else's house. She did not look back. She looked forward at the mountains growing closer on the horizon, at the vast Montana sky stretching blue and endless above them, at the future that terrified her and called to her in equal measure. Freedom, maybe, she thought. Or maybe just a different kind of cage. Either way, she had chosen it. And that for now, for tonight, for this moment, riding toward the mountains with a stranger's arms around her and the past finally behind her, that made all the difference. The Ashford Ranch appeared on the horizon like a small city. That was Meen's first thought as they crested the final ridge in the hour before sunset. Not a ranch, not the way she understood the word from her years at the Hale property. A city, a compound of buildings clustered in a valley that caught the last light and held it, the main house rising 2 stories at the center, whitewashed wood and stone flanked by barns and bunkhouses, and a cookhouse trailing smoke corrals that actually held horses a well, with someone drawing water. A blacksmith's shed with its particular ring carrying faintly across the distance. Everything at the Hale Ranch had the quality of something trying to hold itself together. Everything here had the quality of something that had already won. 40,000 acres, Cade had told her during the ride, and she had nodded as if she could imagine it, as if that number had any relationship to the scale of things she had actually experienced. It didn't. The Hale property had been 300 acres of scrub and hard luck. This was something else entirely, a self-contained world, a declaration in land and livestock and labor that the man who built it intended to remain. Gideon's horse descended toward the compound at a pace that suggested he was returning to his natural element. He straightened in the saddle as the buildings drew closer, the way a man straightens when he comes home after a long absence and feels the full weight of his authority settle back over his shoulders. Meen sat in the circle of Cade's arms and tried to memorize everything at once. A woman appeared on the front porch of the main house as they rode in sturdy, perhaps 50 gray-streaked brown hair pinned back in a bun of pure practicality, wiping her hands on an apron that had seen years of honest use. She watched their approach with the assessing calm of someone who had learned to take the measure of situations before committing to a response. "Mr. Ashford," she said, nodding to Gideon. Then her eyes moved to Cade, and something in her expression warmed slightly barely, but Meen caught it. "Welcome back." "Martha." Cade swung down from the horse, then turned back and reached for Meen. She let herself down with more grace than she'd managed on the way up, though her legs nearly buckled when they met solid ground. 4 hours of riding on a body that hadn't sat a horse in years. She felt every mile of it. Martha's gaze traveled over her methodical, unhurried, taking in the ivory wedding dress, now gray at the hem, with travel dust, the Chinese features, the exhaustion that Meen suspected was written clearly across her face. Her expression gave nothing away. "This is my wife," Cade said. "Meen Ashford. Meen, this is Martha Boone. She runs the household." "Ma'am," Martha said, the word carefully neutral. "Martha," Meen replied, inclining her head. "I'm pleased to meet you. I'm sure you're tired from the journey." Martha was already pivoting back to function, the social moment concluded. "I'll show you to your room. Mr. Cade, your father wants you in his study." It was a dismissal, politely engineered. Cade hesitated, glancing at Meen with something that might have been apology. "I'll find you after," he said quietly. "Make sure you're settled." Then he was gone, following Gideon through the front door, and Meen was left standing in the yard with her single bag and Martha Boone's assessing presence, and the understanding that whatever came next, she was navigating it alone. "This way," Martha said. The inside of the Ashford house was not what Meen had expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she had expected. It was grand in the way frontier things were grand, not delicate, not decorative, not concerned with the impression it made on visitors who cared about delicacy and decoration. The furniture was heavy and dark, built to outlast the people who used it. Paintings of cattle and landscape dominated the walls, some of them actually good, the kind you might find in a proper gallery if someone had thought to bring them here instead. Everything spoke of money deployed in the service of permanence. This was not a house that hoped to endure. This was a house that had already decided to. Martha led her up a wide staircase and down a hallway lined with closed doors. At the end, she pushed one open and stepped aside. "This is the main bedroom," she said. It was Mrs. Ashford's, Cade's mother. She passed 8 years ago. The room was large by any measure. Meen had certainly by the measure of the small room under the eaves she'd left that morning. A substantial bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, a small writing desk positioned near the window to catch the light. Everything clean, everything impersonal. A room waiting for someone to bring it back to life. "Water's in the pitcher," Martha continued. "Bumpers at 6 in the dining room. Mr. Ashford the elder, Mr. Ashford expects punctuality. I'll send Louisa up to help you dress." "That won't be necessary," Meen said quickly. "I can manage." Martha's eyebrow lifted just slightly, just enough to register. "As you wish. Supper at 6. She left, closing the door behind her with a soft, final click. Meen stood alone in the room that had been a dead woman's and let the full weight of the day crash over her. Married, transported 40 miles from everything she'd known. Surrounded by strangers who owed her nothing and had already decided, most of them, how they felt about her presence here. She could not afford to feel any of this right now. She unpacked her single bag into the wardrobe, her few clothes, her mother's hairbrush, the small wooden box she placed on the writing desk where she could see it, washed her face in the basin with cold water that shocked her into alertness, changed from the ivory dress into the dark blue cotton that was the only other thing she owned. braided her hair neatly, and stood in front of the small mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back looked pale and strained and entirely out of place. She pinched color into her cheeks. That was all she could do. She would have to be enough. At 6 o'clock exactly, she made her way downstairs. Voices carried from the dining room, male voices, the particular register of men who spent most of their time outdoors, talking to each other about practical things. She paused in the doorway. Gideon at the head of the table, Cade to his right. Three other men she hadn't met, weathered faces clean, but working clothes, the posture of men who were comfortable at this table because they had earned the right to it. They all looked at her when she appeared. "Our new addition," Gideon said, and the way he said it deliberately casual. The phrase "doing considerable work" told her everything she needed to know about how this supper was going to go. "Gentlemen, this is Cade's wife, Meen." A pause, precise as surgery. "These are some of our senior hands. Thomas Beck, my foreman, James Riley, who manages the Southern Range, and Cal Morrison, who handles the books." The men nodded. Their expressions ranged across a spectrum from carefully blank to openly curious, with nothing that could be honestly called welcoming at any point along it. Meen took the empty seat across from Cade and tried to ignore the fact that every person in the room was watching her do it. Martha and two younger women brought food, beef potatoes, beans, bread that was still warm. Plain and abundant, nothing like the carefully rationed meals at the Hale House. Meen took small portions, aware of every movement she made, every sound her fork produced. "Tell us about yourself," Gideon said after a few minutes of conversation about ranch matters had established the rhythm of the table. His tone was conversational. The sharpness underneath it was only audible if you were listening for it. "Your family, your background." Meen set down her fork just for a moment to give herself a half second to think. "My mother came from San Francisco," she said, keeping her voice level. "She was a seamstress. She married Gerald Hale when I was young. After she passed, I stayed on to help the household." "Chinese then," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. It was a label being applied, a box being checked, a piece of information being sorted into its appropriate file. "Yes. And your father, your real father." The emphasis on real was deliberate and precise. Meen set her fork down, more carefully this time. "I never knew him. My mother didn't speak of him." "I see." Gideon cut into his beef with the systematic efficiency of a man who had been cutting into things, arguments, deals, obstacles his entire life. "And what skills do you bring to this household? What can you contribute?" "Father." Cade's voice was low, a warning minimal. "It's a fair question," Gideon said, not taking his eyes off Meen. "The ranch is a business. Everyone here contributes. I'm simply asking what your wife can offer." Meen met his eyes directly. It was an act of will. "I can cook, clean, mend, and manage household accounts. I can work a garden, preserve food, make do with limited resources. I've been running a household since I was 14. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Hard work," Gideon repeated in the tone of a man turning a coin over to examine both sides. "Yes, I imagine you've done plenty of that." He paused. "But running a ranch household is different from scrubbing floors in a failing homestead. This isn't charity, Mrs. Ashford. We don't keep people who can't pull their weight." The message was clear, unambiguous. "Prove yourself or leave." "I understand," Meen said. "I'll earn my place." Gideon smiled thin and cold. "We'll see." The meal continued around her. The men talked ranch business across and around her presence, the way water moves around a stone in a stream bed, acknowledging the obstacle without addressing it. She ate methodically, tasting nothing, focused entirely on getting through the next hour without giving Gideon Ashford anything he could use against her. When it finally ended and the men dispersed, Cade lingered. "I'm sorry," he said when they were alone in the emptying room. "Your father can be cruel," she supplied. A pause. "I was going to say difficult." "Cruel fits better." He didn't disagree. They stood in the space between the cleared table and the door, and the silence between them was full of things that had no established language yet between two people who had made a commitment without the ordinary groundwork of commitments. He showed her the rest of the house. The parlor, the library with its leather-bound collection, the kitchen where Martha was directing the cleanup with the focused efficiency of a general concluding a campaign. Martha's two assistants looked at Meen with frank curiosity. Neither spoke to her. Meen noted the layout of everything, the pantry, the root cellar, access, the back door, the way the kitchen connected to the rest of the house. She was mapping the territory. It was what she did. Upstairs at the bedroom door, Cade stopped. "This is where you'll sleep," he said. "I use the room next door." He seemed to be choosing his next words with some care. "I thought given that we barely know each other, you might prefer to have privacy. Your own space. Time to—" He stopped. Time. Meen looked at him. Most men in his position would have claimed their legal rights, immediately would have considered any other arrangement a personal slight. The fact that he was offering her choice, genuine choice, was either a kindness or a strategy, and she didn't yet know him well enough to be certain which. "Thank you," she said. "If you need anything, I'm right next door." He hesitated. "And Meen, don't let my father intimidate you. He tests everyone. It's how he maintains control. But you don't have to pass his test to belong here. You're my wife, that's enough." She wanted to believe him. She almost believed him. "Good night, Cade," she said. "Good night." She closed the door of her new room and leaned against it in the dark and let herself feel for just a moment the full frightening weight of where she was and what she had done. Then she undressed, put on the thin nightgown that had been her mother's, and climbed into a bed softer than anything she had slept in years. The room was quiet, private, hers provisionally for whatever that was worth. She had never felt more alone. Sleep came anyway. Sleep always came when the body had been pushed far enough. It came like water rising. The knock on her door before dawn was not gentle. "Breakfast in 30 minutes. Martha's voice brisk and businesslike with the tone of someone who had delivered this particular message many times and had no interest in softening it. "You're expected to help." Meen was dressed and downstairs in 20 minutes. The kitchen in the dark was already warm from the stove, already smelling of coffee and bacon fat, already occupied by Martha and the two women from the night before. The red-haired one, younger, barely 20, with freckles scattered across her nose, looked up when Meen came in with an expression of unconcealed interest. "You can start the biscuits," Martha said without preamble or greeting. "Louisa, show her the lard." The young woman pointed to a lower cabinet. "There. You know how—" "Yes," Meen said. She had made thousands of biscuits. She could make them half asleep, which was nearly what she was doing now. She worked quickly, cutting the cold lard into the flour with practiced efficiency, adding buttermilk in just the right increments, turning the dough out and rolling it without overworking, cutting rounds with a clean press and placing them in the pan with the edges just touching. Martha watched from the corner of her eye, said nothing. "I'm Louise," the red-haired woman said, apparently unable to sustain silence past a certain threshold. "That's Anne." She nodded toward the older woman, quieter and composed, working bacon at the stove. "We help with the house and the cooking." "Are you really from China?" "San Francisco," Meen said, not unkindly. "My mother was from China. I was born in America." Louisa looked momentarily disappointed, as if California were a lesser adventure. "I've never been anywhere but Montana." "What's it like?" Loud, Meen said and meant it. "Crowded, the smell of the bay in the mornings, fog that comes in off the water at night, thick enough to lose yourself in." She slid the biscuits into the oven and began cracking eggs, and something moved in her chest when she said it, a small, precise grief for a city she had left as a child and would probably never see again. "Less talking," Martha said without turning from her work. "Men in 10 minutes." The men arrived exactly on schedule, filling the dining room with the noise and mass and particular animal warmth of people who had already been outside in the cold doing physical work before most of the household woke. Meen helped carry platters, pour coffee, clear plates. She moved efficiently, minimizing contact, learning the rhythms of the table, who sat where, who talked to whom, what kinds of conversation happened here in the morning versus what happened at supper. No one spoke directly to her, but she felt their awareness. The way conversations paused when she approached and resumed when she moved away. The way eyes tracked her movement and then quickly found somewhere else to be. She was the subject they were all carefully not discussing. After breakfast, Martha put her to washing dishes with Louisa drying and Anne sweeping. Familiar work, mindless enough to let her mind do its actual work, cataloging, organizing, building her understanding of this new terrain. "The last Mrs. Ashford," Louisa said, apparently following some internal thread of conversation she'd been having with herself. "She was real particular about how things were done in this house. Martha keeps everything exactly the same. You'll want to learn quick." "Louisa," Martha said from across the room, "I'm just saying it'd help her to know less talking." Louisa flushed but caught Meen's eye and grinned conspiratorially when Martha's back was turned. Meen found her mouth trying to twitch towards something. She suppressed it, but she noted it. At least one person in this house didn't seem hostile. That counted for something. The morning turned into the afternoon and a blur of labor dishes gave way to laundry, gave way to helping Martha prepare the midday meal for the hands who worked close enough to the main house to come in. Meen's hands, which had softened slightly during the 3 days of wedding preparation, quickly remembered their calluses. Her back ached. Her feet hurt. She kept going. At midday, Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Meen for a moment with that assessing expression she was already learning to read, and then said without preamble, "I'm told you can keep books." Meen set down the platter she was carrying. "Yes, I manage the household accounts for the Hale Ranch." "Show me." She followed him to his study, a room that felt like the nerve center of the whole operation. Maps on the walls, correspondence stacked and organized, the particular organized density of a place where real decisions were made. He pulled a ledger from a shelf, opened it to a page of entries, and set it on the desk. "Supply purchases from last month," he said. "Tell me if they're accurate." Meen scanned the columns. Her mind had always worked this way, numbers arranging themselves into patterns, discrepancies catching her eye the way a wrong note catches a musician's ear. She found the first error within 2 minutes. "Here," she said, pointing. "This should be $2.40, not 24. The decimal point is in the wrong place." Gideon's expression didn't change. She looked more carefully. "And here horseshoe purchases on the 5th and the 7th. These serial numbers match. It's the same purchase entered twice." She examined the rest of the page, found a third error, a simple addition mistake, noted it. "Anything else?" he asked. "Not on this page." He was quiet for a moment, studying her notations. Then he closed the ledger. "Cal has been getting sloppy," he said. "Or perhaps testing whether anyone would notice." He paused. "You have a good eye." Not quite a compliment, not an insult, something in between that was probably from Gideon Ashford, as close to encouragement as she was likely to get. "If you want to be useful," he said, "review the books properly, all of them. Find the errors. Report to me by the end of the week." He dismissed her with a turn back to his papers. She returned to the kitchen. "What did he want?" Martha asked, kneading bread with fierce concentration. "To test my bookkeeping. And I found 3 errors." Martha's hands paused for just a moment, a fraction of a hesitation that Meen would have missed if she hadn't been watching closely, then resumed their rhythm. "Cal won't like that. He's proud of his numbers." "I'm sorry," Meen said automatically. Martha looked at her then, a direct level look. "Don't be sorry. Be right. That's all that matters here. Being right and being useful. You can't control whether they like you. You can control whether they need you." She shaped the dough into loaves with practiced certainty. "Do well to remember that," she said. It was the clearest advice anyone had given Meen since she arrived. She filed it away with everything else she was learning about how this household worked, who held what power, what the real currencies were, where the hidden levers were. The afternoon brought more work. The evening brought supper, Cade appearing with dried blood on his shirt from the wolf problem, Gideon asking about losses, the table's conversation flowing around her the way it always did. She ate and listened and continued to map. After supper, Cade found her in the kitchen. "Walk with me," he said. Outside, the air was cool and clear, the sky deepening toward full dark stars beginning to emerge above the mountains. He led her up a slight rise above the compound, and from there she could see the whole valley spread below the ranch's lights, the dark shapes of barns and corrals, the ribbon of Copper Creek catching what was left of the light. "How was your first day?" he asked. "Busy," she said. "Your father had me review ledgers. I found 3 errors." Cade smiled slightly. I'm sure Cal was delighted. "He doesn't know yet. Your father asked for a full review by the end of the week. He's testing you." Cade looked out over the valley, his profile clean against the darkening sky. "Watching to see if you'll follow through. If you're competent, he does it with everyone. What happens if I don't fail? He gives you harder tasks, until you do, or until he finds something else." He turned to look at her. "I'm not telling you this to discourage you. I'm telling you so you know what you're dealing with. My father is brilliant and ruthless, and he does not believe you belong here. He will try to break you." Meen looked at the ranch below the house with its warm windows, the vast land stretching into darkness on all sides. beautiful and harsh and unforgiving, exactly like the man who'd built it. "I won't break," she said. Cade studied her for a long moment. "No," he said finally, "I don't think you will." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, which was itself notable. A silence that didn't require filling between two people who had been strangers that morning and were something else now, some new unnamed thing that had no established language. Then Cade spoke again more carefully. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," he said. Meen felt something tighten. She looked at him. "I told you I chose you because you were real. That's true, but it's not the whole truth." He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cooling air. "My father has been pressuring me to marry for years. He had a list specific candidates, women with connections, land the right family names. He'd spent considerable time vetting them. And I was as far from that list as possible, which is exactly why I chose you." His jaw tightened. "I am tired of being a piece in his games. Tired of every choice being calculated for maximum strategic advantage. When I walked into your house and saw you standing there invisible to everyone in that room, ignored, dismissed, I saw a chance to make a decision that was mine. Not strategic, not approved, just mine." She absorbed this, let it settle. "So you chose me to spite your father. I chose you to claim my own life," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She heard the edge in her own voice and didn't try to dull it. "Either way, I'm a tool, a means to an end. You're my wife. That's not—" "I know what I am." She turned to face him fully. "You gave me privacy, a separate room, respect. I appreciate all of it. But let's not pretend this is something it isn't. You don't love me. I don't love you. We're strangers bound by a contract. And the people in that house would be considerably happier if I didn't exist. I know it's not fair to you. At least at the Hale Ranch, I knew I was unwanted. Here I have to pretend I don't know it." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable one before, heavier, with the weight of things being said aloud for the first time. "You're right," Cade said finally. His voice was rougher. "This isn't fair. I made a decision that changed your entire life for my own reasons. That's selfish," he paused. "But I meant what I said. You're my wife. That means something to me, even if it doesn't to you yet. I will protect you. I will defend you. I will make sure you have a place here, whether my father accepts it or not." "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter to you?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, as if he was giving something up that he usually kept carefully contained. "When I was 12, and," he said, "my mother got sick. Some kind of wasting illness the doctors couldn't name or treat. She spent 2 years dying slowly." He looked at the mountains. "My father threw money at specialists who couldn't help her. And during those 2 years, do you know what he did? He worked, expanded the ranch, made deals, built his empire, because sitting with her, watching her fade, that wasn't productive. That didn't serve his goals." Meen said nothing, just listened. "She died alone," Cade said, "in the middle of the night. My father was in Helena negotiating water rights. I was asleep. She just slipped away." He stopped, started again. "When I found her in the morning, I remember thinking that she had spent her whole life making herself small enough to fit into my father's world, and it had killed her." He turned back to Meen. "All right, Meen." His eyes were very direct in the dark. "I swore I'd never do that. Never let anyone I cared about disappear because it was convenient. So no, I don't resent defending you. I resent that you need defending. But as long as you do, I will. The alternative is becoming my father, and I would genuinely rather die." The words hung between them, raw and honest in the cooling night air. Meen felt something shift in her chest. Not love. She knew what she felt was not love, not yet, maybe not ever, but the beginning of something. Trust, maybe. Or simply the startling, disorienting recognition of being seen by someone who had decided in advance that what they found when they looked would be worth seeing. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once, then with the slight change in his posture that she was already learning, meant he was moving back to practicality. "Come on, I want to show you something." They rode out the next morning, he on his gray gelding, her on a chestnut mare named Rosie, who was exactly as gentle as advertised, and climbed into the foothills on a trail that wound through pine and sage and over rocky outcroppings. The air grew thinner and cleaner. The landscape shifted from the managed order of the ranch to something older and less interested in human intentions. At the top, a clearing, and from the clearing the whole valley spread below. Meen stood at the edge and looked at it and understood why Cade's mother had come here. The problems that had felt enormous on the valley floor looked appropriately small from this height. The ranch compound was a cluster of matchboxes. Copper Creek was a silver thread. The mountains continued past all of it, vast and permanent and entirely indifferent. She said it helped her remember the ranch wasn't the whole world. Cade said, standing beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, that there was more beyond it. Did it help? Meen asked. I come here when the walls start closing in. He glanced at her. It's the only way to survive in that house, sometimes escaping without actually leaving. They stood together watching cloud shadows move across the valley, and Meen thought about what it meant that he had brought her here, that he had chosen to show her his private geography, that he wanted her to have this place to come to when she needed it. Something else shifted, something small and cautious, and not yet willing to be named. The ride back seemed shorter. By the time they reached the compound, the sun was high, and Thomas was waiting by the main house with his weathered face set in the particular configuration that meant news. Mr. Ashford wants you both, he said, his study. Gideon's study, when they entered it, held an additional element. Cal Morrison, the bookkeeper, lean and nervous with thinning hair and hands that wouldn't stay still. He had the look of a man who knew the walls were moving inward and couldn't find the door. We have a problem, Gideon said. Sir, Cal started. Be quiet. Gideon looked at Meen, and there was something new in his expression, still not warmth, that was clearly not on the menu, but acknowledgement, a slight recalibration. Thomas reviewed your findings, he said. They're accurate. Every single discrepancy you noted exists exactly as documented. Meen let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Cal has admitted to taking money from the supply accounts over the past 8 months, Gideon continued. He claims it was for gambling debts, that he intended to repay it. I did intend to, Cal's voice broke. Mr. Ashford, I've been with this ranch 15 years. I've got nowhere to. You stole from me. Gideon's voice carried the particular coldness of someone who had made a decision and found it easy. Intent doesn't change that. Get your things. You have 1 hour to be off my land. Cal's face crumpled. He appealed, begged, invoked 15 years of service. Gideon had already moved past him. Thomas took Cal's arm and guided him out of the room, not unkindly, and then it was just Gideon and Cade and Meen. Gideon looked at her. You were right, he said. The words cost him something. You could hear the price of them. I owe you an apology. Meen inclined her head. Thank you. Don't thank me. You did good work. Work that should have been done months ago. He stood moved to the window, looked at his empire. Cal was lazy. I kept him too long out of misplaced loyalty. That was my mistake. He turned back. You'll take the position. Full accounting, supply management, payroll. Weekly reports. Meen blinked. You've been here less than a week, Gideon continued as if she hadn't, and in that week you've proven yourself more competent than a man I trusted for 15 years. You'll do the work. You'll do it well. And you'll be compensated fairly. He named a salary. The number was more money than Meen had ever imagined having for herself. An actual salary, not charity, not scraps, not the bare minimum of survival. Money she would earn, that would be hers. Do you accept? Gideon asked. Yes, she said, finding her voice. I accept. Good, you start tomorrow. Cal's office is yours. Make whatever changes you need. He sat back down, already returning to his papers. Now get out. Both of you, I have work to do. Outside in the hallway, Cade grabbed her shoulders and looked at her with genuine delight, an expression she hadn't seen on him before, unguarded and bright. Do you understand what just happened? He said. My father admitted he was wrong, in front of witnesses. He admitted it and gave you authority over ranch finances. He has never, he stopped, shook his head at still grinning. He never does that. He doesn't trust me, Meen said. He needs me. That's different. Maybe, but it's a start. Martha's only response to the news was a satisfied sound and a comment that anyone with eyes could see. Meen had a head for numbers. Louisa was briefly beside herself with excitement, declaring it the most romantic thing she had ever heard. You caught the thief like a detective in a novel, until Martha told her to go do something useful. That evening, alone in the office that was now hers, small, cramped, smelling of old ledger paper and the previous occupant's habits, ran her hand over the worn surface of the desk and let herself feel something she had not felt in a long time. Pride. Earned, not given. Claimed, not assigned. She sat down at the desk, opened the topmost ledger, and began to work. 3 days later, well past midnight, she found the theft. Not the simple errors she'd been cataloging, the decimal points, the transpositions, the arithmetic mistakes that spoke of carelessness. This was something else. This was deliberate. Someone had been skimming money from the supply accounts for months. Phantom vendors, inflated costs, small amounts carefully distributed, $5 here, 8 there, 12, somewhere else, the kind of discrepancies that would be easy to dismiss as rounding errors if you weren't looking closely enough. Over 6 months, it added up to nearly $300. Meen sat back in her chair and rubbed her eyes and stared at the pattern she'd mapped across 3 separate ledgers. The office door opened. "It's past midnight," Cade said from the doorway. He was in shirt sleeves, clearly not yet sleeping. "I saw the light. I'm nearly done." He moved closer, looking at the work spread across the desk. His eyes sharpened. "How much?" "About 40 in simple errors." She paused. "Close to 300 in what looks like theft." The word landed in the room like something physical. "You're certain? See for yourself." She walked him through it, the pattern she'd found, the phantom entries, the vendor names that appeared in the ledger but had no corresponding record in the shipping manifests. Someone had been careful. Not careful enough. "Cal," Cade said, his jaw tight, "I don't know yet. It could be anyone with access to the books." She hesitated. "Your father won't be pleased." "My father will be furious, but not at you." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression she recognized now, something she was learning to trust. "This is good work, Meen. Thorough." The praise moved through her with a warmth she didn't know how to be comfortable with. She turned back to the ledgers. "I should write up my findings properly before tomorrow." He reached past her and extinguished the lamp. "Tonight you sleep. You'll make yourself sick working like this." She wanted to argue. Her body, which had been running on stubbornness and coffee for 3 days, overruled her. She let him guide her out of the office and up the stairs to her bedroom door. He paused there. "Thank you," he said, "for doing this, for finding it." A pause. "My father tests people, but he also trusts the wrong ones sometimes. Cal has been with the ranch for 15 years. Father would never have suspected him." "We still don't know it's Cal," Meen said. "No, but we know it's someone." His expression hardened. "And we'll find out who." She presented her findings to Gideon the next morning. Written out, neatly organized by category, the evidence mapped clearly enough that a child could follow it. She laid the papers on his desk and stepped back and waited. Gideon read in silence. Minutes passed. "Cal Morrison," he said finally, "has worked for this ranch since before Cade was born." "The numbers don't lie," Meen said. "Numbers can be misinterpreted." His eyes were cold, especially by someone unfamiliar with how a ranch operates. "You've been here less than a week. You don't know how things work." "I know how bookkeeping works, and someone has been stealing from you." The silence that followed had an edge to it. Gideon stood moving around the desk with the deliberate physicality of a man who understood that his size was itself a form of argument. He was close enough that she could feel the particular temperature of his authority. "Let me be very clear," he said. His voice was quiet, which made it worse. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I will not have you disrupting my operation with baseless accusations. Cal Morrison is worth 10 of you. If you think you can undermine him to secure your own position—" "Father," Cade's voice came from the doorway like a blade. "That's enough. This is ranch business. My wife concerns me, and you will not speak to her that way." The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. Meen stood very still between them, caught in the field of something old and complicated, years of accumulated power struggles, old resentments, the ongoing negotiation between a father who had built an empire and a son who had grown up inside it and never entirely accepted the terms. "Your wife," Gideon said, turning the phrase with deliberate precision, "has accused a loyal employee of theft based on a week of looking at numbers she doesn't understand." "Then respond to the evidence." Cade moved into the room, picked up Meen's papers. "These are detailed and specific. Either they're accurate or they're not. Have Thomas review them. Bring in an auditor from Helena, but stop standing there bullying her because you don't like what she found." Gideon's face darkened in a way that suggested he was genuinely unused to being spoken to this way and had not yet decided how to respond to it. The silence stretched. Meen held her breath. Then Gideon's control reasserted itself visibly the way you can see a machine returning to its set point after being knocked off balance. He smiled cold and sharp. "Very well," he said. "I'll have Thomas review her findings. We'll see what he discovers." He gestured dismissal. "You're both excused." In the hallway, Meen's legs trembled with the accumulated strain of the past hour. Cade took her elbow, steadying her. "He thinks I'm lying," she said. "He thinks everyone's lying. It's how his mind works." Martha looked at Meen's face when they reached the kitchen, poured coffee without being asked, and set it in front of her with the practicality of someone who had learned that action was more useful than comment. "Thomas is honest," Martha said. When Cade explained, "If the numbers are wrong, he'll say so." "And if they're right," Cade said, "then we have a thief. Then Mr. Ashford will have to admit that the Chinese girl was right." Martha resumed kneading. The way she said it, matter of fact without judgment, simply naming the shape of the thing somehow made it worse. Not because she was being cruel, because she wasn't. She was simply describing reality. That is what I will always be to them, Meen thought. The Chinese girl, the outsider, always suspect, always proving. The results came that afternoon. Thomas's report was unambiguous. Cal Morrison, confronted with the evidence, had admitted everything: gambling debts, the slow, careful skimming he'd told himself was temporary, the certainty he could replace it before anyone noticed. He was given an hour to collect his belongings. He left the property crying. Gideon called Meen to his study. "You were right," he said. The words cost him more this time somehow. "I owe you an apology." "You said that already," Meen said carefully. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth, not yet, possibly not ever, but the very first edges of something that might eventually become respect. "So I did." He moved to the window, studied his compound. "Cal was sloppy, lazy. I kept him too long out of loyalty that he didn't deserve. That's on me." He turned, his eyes found hers directly. "You'll take the position. Full accounting, supply management, payroll, weekly reports, and you'll be compensated accordingly." He named the same salary as before. "Do you accept?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I accept us." "Good." He sat, turned back to his desk. "Get out. I have work to do." Outside, Cade was waiting. When she told him, that unguarded grin broke across his face again, and she found herself almost smiling back despite everything. "You did it," he said. "On your own terms." "I haven't done anything yet," she said. "I've just started." But standing in the hallway of the Ashford house with the position she had earned and the salary she had been promised, Meen felt something small and cautious and stubborn begin to take root. Not belonging, not yet, maybe not for a long time, but the very beginning of it, the seed of something that might in time have a name. That evening, alone in her office with the lamp burning and the ledgers spread before her, she made herself a promise. She would not disappear in this house. Whatever it cost, however long it took, she was going to matter here. The ledgers gave up their secrets, slowly, like bodies surrendering old wounds. Meen spent 3 days in the office that was now hers, working backward through Cal Morrison's books with the systematic patience she'd developed over years of managing accounts that couldn't afford a single mistake. Most of what she found was simple carelessness, the inevitable accumulation of small errors in any record-keeping operation. Transposed digits, decimal points gone wandering, addition that had been checked against itself rather than against an independent calculation. She marked these in pencil, added marginal notes, prepared corrections. But underneath the carelessness, something else. It was subtle, careful. The kind of theft that presumed on the assumption that no one was paying close enough attention. Phantom vendors appearing in purchase records, inflated quantities on supply orders. The same invoice entered twice with slightly different dates to obscure the duplication. Small amounts, carefully distributed. Over 6 months, nearly $300. Meen sat back in her chair at midnight on the third day, rubbing her tired eyes, and looked at what she had mapped. Someone had been very patient, she thought, and very certain they wouldn't be caught. The lamp burned low. The house was silent around her. Through the window, the Montana sky was fully dark, brilliant with stars that had no competition from any other light for 50 miles in any direction. She was still studying the pattern when the door opened. Cade stood in the doorway in shirt sleeves, his hair disarranged, wearing the look of someone who had tried to sleep and failed. He saw the lamp, saw the ledgers, came to look at what she'd found. How much, he asked when she showed him. About 40 in simple errors, close to 300 in what appears to be deliberate theft. The word dropped into the quiet room and changed its temperature. She walked him through it, the phantom entries, the vendor names that existed in the ledger, but nowhere else the pattern that became undeniable once you laid the three affected accounts side by side. He studied it with the same focused attention she'd come to recognize in him, the quality of someone who didn't pretend to understand things they didn't yet understand. Cal, he said finally, I don't know yet. It could be anyone with access to the books. Cal's the only one who had unsupervised access. His jaw was tight. My father won't want to hear this. Your father will be furious, but the numbers are what they are. He looked at her for a moment, that quality of looking that she was still learning to receive without flinching, the quality of being genuinely seen. This is good work, he said, careful, thorough. The warmth that moved through her at the words was disproportionate, and she knew it. She turned back to the ledgers. I should write it up properly before I present it. Organize the evidence clearly enough that there's no room for misinterpretation. Tonight you sleep. He reached past her and extinguished the lamp. Tomorrow you present it. You'll think more clearly after you've rested. She wanted to protest. Her body said otherwise. She let him guide her out of the office and up the dark stairs to her door, where he paused. Thank you, he said quietly, for not giving up on this when my father pushed back. For finding it. It was in the numbers, as she said. I just read what was there. In her room, she lay in the dark and thought about Cade's mother dying alone while Gideon negotiated water rights in Helena. She thought about Cade at 12 years old finding her in the morning. She thought about what it cost a person to grow up inside that story and try to become someone different. Then she stopped thinking and let sleep take her. The morning presentation went as she had anticipated it would. Gideon's initial resistance, the accusation that she was inventing problems to make herself indispensable, the cold pressure of his physical presence as he moved around the desk. Then Cade in the doorway, iron in his voice, demanding that the evidence be treated as evidence. Then the tense, dangerous silence of Gideon making a calculation. Thomas reviewed her findings that afternoon. His report was unambiguous. Cal Morrison, confronted by Thomas in the barn office, sat with his nervous hands, in his 15 years, in his gambling debts, and admitted everything. He left the property within the hour, still appealing to a man who had already stopped listening. Gideon called her to his study, apologized the first time she suspected in recent memory, offered her the position, the salary, the authority. She accepted. And standing in the hallway afterward with Cade's delighted face beside her, and the sound of Martha refusing to be insufferable about being right, carrying from the kitchen, Meen felt the first small, cautious stirring of something that might eventually become pride. She had done this, not by performing, not by making herself agreeable, by being right. That was worth more than she had a language for. The next 2 weeks were the closest thing to normal she had experienced since her mother died. She threw herself into the accounting work with the particular ferocity of someone who had been waiting years for something genuinely difficult to do. She learned the ranch's rhythms, who supplied what, when payments were due, how to track inventory across 40,000 acres and a rotating workforce. She built systems where Cal's chaos had been created, ledger formats that could be audited at a glance, established vendor verification processes that would make the kind of theft she'd uncovered considerably harder to sustain. The ranch hands began to bring their supply requests to her office. They learned that she was fair, that she didn't punish them for asking, didn't make them feel foolish for needing, but thorough, that every discrepancy would be found eventually, and it was better to come to her with questions than to hope she wouldn't notice. Thomas started consulting her about purchases, deferring to her judgment on prices. Gideon stopped testing her. That was perhaps the most significant change. He still wasn't warm. She had stopped expecting warmth, but the testing had ceased, replaced by a working expectation. He read her weekly reports carefully, occasionally nodded at a decision she'd made, spoke to her in the dining room about ranch business as if she were a person whose opinions on such matters were potentially worth hearing. It wasn't acceptance, but it was a kind of presence in the room. One evening, working late, Cade pulled a chair up across from her desk. You're thriving, he said. I'm surviving, she corrected, not looking up from the ledger. There's a difference. Is there? She set down her pen. Thriving implies I'm becoming part of this place. Surviving means I'm finding ways to exist here without disappearing. Those aren't the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then are you happy? The question caught her completely off guard. No one had asked her that before. Not once in her life, as far as she could recall, had anyone asked whether she was happy. I don't know, she said honestly. I'm busy, useful, less afraid than I was. She looked at him. Is that happiness? I don't know either, he said. His smile was crooked and self-aware. I've never been very good at recognizing it. They sat in comfortable silence, the lamp burning between them. The coyote calling somewhere out in the dark hills, and Meen thought that whatever this was, this strange, provisional, carefully maintained thing that was neither friendship nor marriage. In any conventional sense, it was something she had not had before. Someone to sit in silence with, without the silence being a form of punishment. Then the door banged open. Thomas stood there in the state of hymn shirt, torn at the shoulder blood, dark and wet down his left side face, stripped of its usual controlled composure, told her everything before he said a word. Cade, he said. His voice was steady. The steadiness of it was the most frightening thing. We've got trouble. Cade was on his feet. What happened? Riders hit the Eastern Line camp about an hour ago. Burned it. Thomas's eyes moved once to Meen, then back. Frank's dead. 2 others wounded. They left a message. He paused. Said they're coming for the water rights. Said Ashford's time is over. The air in the room changed entirely. Meen felt it leave her chest, not all at once, but in a single slow pressure, like a hand pressing down. Cade's face had gone to stone. How many riders? 6, maybe 8. Hard to tell in the dark. They knew what they were doing, hit fast, burned, everything disappeared into the hills before anyone could organize a response. Your father needs to hear this. He already knows. Gideon's voice from behind Thomas in the hallway. He moved into the room fully dressed, despite the hour, his face carved with cold fury. Not the hot fury of someone surprised, but the cold, considered fury of someone who had been waiting for something like this and had simply not known when it would arrive. I heard the commotion. Thomas, get every man armed and ready. I want patrols on every section by dawn. Sir, the men are exhausted. I don't care if they're dead on their feet. Someone just killed one of ours and burned our property. We respond now or we look weak. Gideon's eyes moved to Cade. You'll lead the Southern Patrol. 6 men. Reports every 2 hours. What about the wounded? Martha's tending them in the bunkhouse. They'll live. He turned to go, then paused. His eyes found Meen. You'll stay into the house. Lock your door. This doesn't concern you. He was gone before she could respond. Thomas followed already, calling to men she could hear stirring in the bunkhouse, boots, hitting boards. Voices low and urgent, the metallic sounds of rifles being checked and loaded. Within minutes, the compound had transformed from sleeping to bristling. Cade grabbed his gun belt from the hook by the door, buckled it with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done this before. He's right, he said without looking at her. Stay inside, keep away from the windows. Who would do this, she asked. The water rights. There's a group of ranchers north of here who claim my father stole their access to Copper Creek 20 years ago. They've been fighting it in court for years, but the territorial judges keep ruling in our favor. He checked his rifle, his movements economical and practiced. Guess they decided the courts weren't going to give them what they needed. He moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back. He crossed the room in 3 strides and kissed her quick, hard, with something underneath it that might have been fear or might have been something else entirely. Lock the door, he said. Don't open it for anyone but me or Martha. Then he was gone. Meen stood alone in the office with the taste of him still on her lips and the sound of horses being saddled in the yard and the particular silence that follows when someone you have started to care about rides into danger and there is nothing you can do about it. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she moved. Martha was in the kitchen, already working boiling water, tearing clean sheets into strips, with the systematic efficiency of someone who had done this before and did not require directions. 2 with bullet wounds, 1 with burns, Martha said without looking up. Help me carry these to the bunkhouse. Gideon said to stay inside. Gideon can go to hell. Martha stacked bandages into Meen's arms. I need hands. You've got hands. Come on. The bunkhouse was chaos and noise, and the particular violence of its smell, blood-scorched flesh, sweat, fear, concentrated in a small space. Two men lay on cots, a third sitting upright, with his burned arm held away from his body, his face gray. Others stood around in the urgent, helpless way of people who wanted to do something and didn't know what. "Whiskey," Martha ordered, pointing, "and clean water. Move." The next hour was not something Meen had a language for. She held men down while Martha cleaned wounds that made her stomach turn. She poured alcohol onto burns and felt the men's bodies jerk under her hands. She learned to brace herself when Martha worked to hold steady, when the person under her hands screamed to keep pressure on bandages through the trembling and the flinching to focus on function, because function was the only thing that helped. Martha's hands never wavered. She worked with the brutal efficiency of someone who had done this too many times and had long since passed the point, Ben, where emotion was useful. You either learned mean thought or you watched people die. "You've done this before," she said when Martha tied off the last suture. "Frontier life." Martha wiped her hands on the apron that was already ruined. "You learn or you watch people die." She looked at Meen directly. "You did well, didn't faint, didn't panic." It was as close to praise as Martha got. From outside came the sound of riders departing Cade's patrol, 6 men on horseback, moving south in the dark, armed, and riding toward people who had already killed tonight. Meen stood in the bunkhouse doorway and watched until she couldn't see them anymore, until the darkness had taken them completely. "He'll be fine," Martha said behind her. Her voice carried the particular quality of a statement made for pragmatic rather than certain reasons. "Does that work?" Meen asked. "Saying it." A pause. "Sometimes." They set up the dining room as a hospital while the compound settled into armed waiting tables, cleared sheets, laid down supplies, organized. Martha had done this before. Everything she did had the quality of established procedure, of a response to something that had happened enough times to have a system. "How often?" Meen asked. "Water skirmishes, every few years." Martha arranged bandage rolls with the precision of someone who knew exactly how many she'd need. "Usually they settle in court or through negotiation. Sometimes," she gestured at the preparations around them, "sometimes men decide violence is faster." "What will Gideon do, Pam?" Martha met her eyes directly. The lamp between them made both their faces look older and more honest than daylight usually allowed. "Whatever he thinks will win," she said. "Gideon Ashford doesn't believe in half measures. If he thinks burning their ranches will end this, he'll burn them. If he thinks killing their leaders will work, he'll kill them. He built this empire by being more ruthless than everyone else." A pause. "He's not going to stop now. He's not going to stop now." The words settled into Meen's chest like stones. She returned to her office. The ledger seemed absurd, now trivial, against the weight of men dying over creek access. She tried to work and couldn't. The numbers refused to arrange themselves into meaning. Her mind kept going to Cade on horseback in the dark, to Thomas's bloodied shirt, to the man in the bunkhouse, whose burned arm might or might not heal properly. She fell asleep at her desk eventually, her cheek on the account book, and woke in the gray early morning light with her neck aching and the sounds of the house returning to life around her. Martha was in the kitchen making breakfast with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a necessary function, regardless of everything else. "Thomas sent a rider back an hour ago," she said when Meen appeared. "They found tracks heading north toward the Peterson Ranch. Gideon's taken men to confront them. And Cade, with him." Meen ate without tasting anything and went to help with the work that kept a ranch running through crises, through any other day bread, to bake laundry, to start the endless maintenance of a household that couldn't simply stop because men were riding around armed in the hills. Louisa appeared mid-morning with red eyes and a face that told the whole story before she opened her mouth. "Is it true?" she said. "And Frank's really—" "Yes," Martha said without softening it. Louisa's hands went to her mouth. Her shoulders began to shake. Meen hadn't known. Hadn't been paying enough attention to the currents of the household, too focused on ledgers and proving her worth, and she hadn't known that Louisa and Frank had been courting, hadn't understood that the name was attached to a specific grief in this room. She put her arm around Louisa's shoulders and felt the younger woman collapse against her, sobbing, with the full body intensity of someone whose body had decided this was beyond its capacity for control. "It's not fair," Louisa gasped. We had plans." "I know," Meen murmured. "I know." She held her while Martha worked around them with the deliberate practicality of a woman who understood that grief required its time and would not be usefully shortened. The riders returned just before noon, too many horses moving too fast. Meen heard them from the kitchen and ran outside without deciding to the way you run toward things when your body knows before your mind does what they mean. Cade was in front. His face was set unreadable in the way that meant he was working very hard to keep it that way. His shirt was torn at the left sleeve, dark and wet. Behind him, 6 riders. Between them, 4 men on horses with their hands bound behind them, exhausted, defiant, bleeding in various ways. Gideon rode beside his son, his expression carved from ice. "Put them in the barn," he ordered Thomas, who was already moving. "Under guard. No one talks to them without my permission." The prisoners were dragged from their horses. Thomas and 2 other hands marched them toward the barn. The other men dismounted with the controlled exhaustion of people who had spent all night in saddles and still had work to do. Meen's eyes found Cade. He swung down from his horse and moved stiffly, favoring the left arm she saw, and when he saw her, something in his face relaxed very slightly, the way something tight releases. "You're hurt," she said. "Grazed." He glanced toward the barn, then back. "It's nothing. We found them at the Peterson place. Evidence they were behind last night's attack." His voice was flat, the particular flatness of someone describing things they haven't yet finished processing. "Let's get inside." Martha cleaned the wound in the kitchen with brisk, practiced hands. It was shallow, a bullet that had torn the meat of his upper arm without hitting bone, or major vessel, painful but not dangerous. And Cade sat through the cleaning without flinching or making a sound, which was either courage or the habit of a man who had learned that showing pain was more trouble than it was worth. "What happened?" Meen asked while Martha worked. "Rode to Peterson's place just before dawn. Found these 4 men and what looked like evidence, kerosene cans, maps of our line camps. One of them had Frank's pocket watch." His voice stayed flat. "Peterson himself wasn't there. Claimed he had no knowledge, that these men were acting on their own." "Do you believe him?" A pause. "No." Gideon's voice came from the doorway. "My study, 10 minutes, both of you." The study held more people than usual. Thomas' 2 senior hands, whose names Meen was still learning, Cade and now her. Gideon stood behind his desk with the posture of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and was explaining it as a courtesy. "We have 4 men who participated in a coordinated attack that killed one of ours and destroyed ranch property," he said. "Peterson claims ignorance, but this was planned. They knew exactly where to hit us." "What do you want to do?" Thomas asked. "I want justice. I want them to pay, and I want every rancher in this valley to understand what happens when you come at the Ashfords." Gideon's eyes were cold and very clear. "We'll hold them until the territorial marshal arrives. Let the law handle it formally. But in the meantime, I want to know everything: who planned this, who funded it, who else is involved." "And if they don't talk?" one of the hands asked. Gideon smiled. It was a terrible expression, not cruel exactly, but entirely without mercy. "They'll talk," he said. "I'll make certain of it." Meen felt something cold move down her spine. Frontier justice. She had heard the phrase before and understood it in the abstract. She had never expected to find herself standing in the room where it was arranged. "Meen," Gideon's eyes moved to her. "You'll document everything. Names, statements, evidence. I want a complete record, ready for the marshal." "Sir, I'm not certain You can write, you can organize information. That's all I need." He pulled a clean ledger from the shelf, set it on the edge of the desk. "Start now. Interview the men we brought back. Get their accounts on paper before they have time to coordinate their stories." She looked at Cade. He met her eyes and she saw the conflict. There, he didn't want her involved in this, didn't want her in the room where whatever Gideon planned happened, but he also couldn't protect her from this particular assignment without undermining his father in front of his men. And that was a cost with consequences he was calculating even as she watched. "I'll do it," she said quietly. The barn office smelled of hay and horse and the specific sourness of fear. The chair in the center of the room had rope marks on the arms. Meen noted them, did not think too closely about what they meant. The first prisoner was brought in, the one with the head wound, dried blood crusted dark at his temple, eyes hard and defiant beneath the exhaustion. Thomas tied his hands to the chair arms, not brutally, but firmly, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. "He's all yours," Thomas said. "Call if you need anything." He left. Meen stood alone with the man across a small demo. Her ledger open in front of her, her pen ready, and the weight of what she was doing pressing down on her from several directions at once. Name, she asked. The man looked at her with the particular contempt reserved for people who represent the wrong side of a conflict. Go to hell, China girl. She held his eyes. The territorial marshal is coming. You can tell your story to me now, or you can tell it to him later. But Mr. Ashford wants answers, and he'll get them one way or another. Cooperation might make the difference between a prison sentence and a rope. Ashford can hang me himself, the man said. Won't change what's coming. But there was something underneath the defiance, not quite softening, but a crack in it. The specific crack that appears when someone needs to be heard and hasn't been. Then tell me why, Meen said quietly. She set down her pen. Start from the beginning. Why did you do this? Maybe it was her tone. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe the man had been carrying it for so long that any opening was enough. He started talking. His name was Samuel Garrett. He had ranched north of the Ashford property for 15 years. He had 3 children and had buried a wife 5 years ago, and had watched the water access that kept his land viable be slowly, systematically, legally stripped away through a decade of court maneuvers. He didn't have the money to adequately contest. Gideon Ashford owned the judges, Garrett said. His voice was rough and certain. He owned the lawyers who wrote the laws, the politicians who changed the rules when the rules didn't go his way. We tried the courts. We spent every dollar we had, and we got the same answer every time legal. He was legal. The contempt in the word made it into something else entirely. So yeah, we burned his line camp. We killed his man. Because when the law won't protect you, when the people who are supposed to administer justice have been bought by the man taking from you, what else is there? Meen wrote it all down, every word. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. She interviewed the other 3 prisoners over the following hours. Each man told a variation of the same story. Desperation, exhausted legal options, violence as a last resort, a genuine and unshakable belief that what they'd done was defense rather than attack. They all admitted to the raid. None of them expressed remorse. By the time she finished, the sun was setting and her head ached with the weight of what she'd heard. She carried the ledger back to Gideon's study. He was reading correspondence by lamplight. His expression settled and composed the expression of a man whose world had been attacked and who had already made his peace with how he intended to respond. Well, he said, they've all admitted to the attack. She set the ledger on the desk. They claim you stole water rights that belonged to them through fraudulent legal processes. They claim, Gideon said. The emphasis was the entirety of his dismissal. They believe it, genuinely. She paused. Whether they're right is a different question. Gideon's eyes narrowed. Explain. This was the most important test yet she understood. More important than the ledgers, more important than Cal Morrison's theft. This was Gideon asking whether she would tell him what he wanted to hear. The water rights transfers are legal by territorial law, she said carefully. The documents are in order, but the men who wrote those laws were the same men who benefited from them. Wealthy ranchers who arrived first and structured the rules to protect their advantage. Legal doesn't always mean just. Justice, Gideon said, is a luxury for people who can afford it. Out here, survival is what matters. I secured water access for this ranch because without water, we die. Those men want what I have because they failed to secure it themselves. That's not injustice. That's competition. Is it? She heard herself before she could stop it. Or is it theft dressed in legal language? The silence that followed had a dangerous quality. The specific dangerous quality of silence that precedes a decision about whether to punish or to think. Cade appeared in the doorway, Thomas behind him, his hand not quite near his gun. Then Gideon laughed. It was not a warm sound. It was not meant to reassure. But it was not hostile either. It was the sound of a man encountering something unexpected and finding it genuinely interesting. You're honest, he said, brutally so. Most people tell me what they think I want to hear. You tell me what you actually think. A pause. That's either very brave or very stupid. Probably both, Meen said. Gideon studied her for a long moment. Then his expression settled back into its usual imperturbable control. Those men will hang. The law used to take the water rights is the same law that will execute them for murder. That's how power works. You make the rules, then you enforce them. He moved to the window. They should have understood that before they started burning my property. And if they were right, she pressed, If you did steal from them, then I stole well enough that it doesn't matter. He turned. You are married to my son. You keep my books. You live under my roof. You don't get to stand in my study and judge me for the methods I used to build what you now benefit from. The truth of it hit her like cold water. She had been here 3 weeks. She had a salary and a position and a room that was hers. All of it, every bit of the security she had carved out was built on the empire Gideon had constructed. She was not outside looking in. She was inside. You're right, she said quietly. I apologize. Don't apologize. Just remember who you're working for and what that means. He gestured dismissal. Send word to the marshal and Helena. Tell him we're holding 4 men for murder and arson. In the hallway, Cade caught her arm. Are you all right? No, she looked at him directly. Cade, did your father steal those water rights? His face was unreadable. Does it matter? Yes, it matters. My father built this ranch by being smarter and tougher than everyone else. Some of his methods were questionable, some were probably illegal. But this is frontier Montana. Everyone's hands are dirty. The only difference is who wins. He paused. And if the people he beat were in the right, then they should have fought harder. Meen pulled her arm free. I need to think. She walked away, heard him call her name, did not stop. Outside, the night was cold and clear. She walked to the horse corral and leaned on the fence and looked at the mountains and tried to understand the shape of the impossible position she was in. She had thought she was escaping something when she left the Hale house. Instead, she had walked into something else, a different kind of complicity, a different set of walls, a larger and more comfortable cage. Quite a mess, isn't it? Martha's voice. Meen turned to find her standing a few feet away, a shawl around her shoulders, not quite looking at her. I don't know what to do, Meen said. You survive, Martha said simply. Same as the rest of us. She came to stand beside her at the fence. You think you're the first person to realize Gideon Ashford isn't a saint? You think we all work here because we love the man? She paused. We work here because he pays well, and he's powerful enough to protect us from worse things than his ambition. That's not enough. Maybe not, but it's what we have. Martha's voice was not unkind. You want to make a difference, want to actually change things, then you stay. You gain influence. You wait for your moment. You don't do it by running away the first time you don't like what you discover. What moment? The one where you have enough power to matter, where people listen when you speak, where your opinion changes outcomes. Martha looked at her steadily. You've been here 3 weeks, and you already manage the ranch finances. Gideon trusts your judgment enough to put you in that barn interviewing his prisoners. You're married to his son. She paused. Give it time. Meen stood in the dark and thought about water rights and desperate men and the distance between legal and just. She thought about the 4 prisoners in the barn who had done terrible things for reasons she couldn't entirely dismiss. She thought about Frank, who was dead, and Louisa, who was crying in the house behind her, and the family Frank would never go home to. Stay, she decided finally. Not because you approve, not because you think this is right, but because Martha is right. You have more power here than anywhere else. And power means the possibility of change. But first she needed to understand exactly what Gideon had done, not the outline she'd glimpsed. The full picture, every document, every legal maneuver, every judge who'd been paid, and every claim that had been filed under deliberately obscure language. She needed to know what she was complicit in before she could decide what to do about it. She pushed off the fence and went back inside. There was work to do. She began digging the next morning. The ranch hummed around her with the particular tension of a place that has been attacked and is still deciding how to respond. Armed patrols rotating through the compound. The prisoners in the barn under guard whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Meen moved through it all and went to the records room off Gideon's study and began pulling every document that touched the Ashford water rights. The files went back 23 years. The early years were straightforward homestead applications, territorial land grants, legitimate purchases from families heading east. Everything properly documented, properly filed, the ordinary machinery of frontier acquisition. Around year 7, the character of the documents changed. Meen traced it forward, carefully building the picture. A claim filed by a rancher named Peterson, the same Peterson whose property they'd ridden to in the night rejected on a technicality, about survey markers. Those same markers then used by Gideon to extend his own boundary claim 6 months later. A water rights transfer from the territorial government signed by an official who had left that office 3 months before the document's date. Witness testimony attached to several key filings from men who had appeared on the Ashford payroll within a year of providing it. Individually, any one of these could be explained. A filing error, an administrative oversight. The territorial system was imprecise, its records inconsistently kept its officials not always scrupulous. Together laid out across the desk in chronological order, they formed a pattern with only one possible reading. Find anything interesting, Cade. In the doorway, his bandaged arm held slightly away from his body, exhaustion visible in the lines around his eyes. Your father is brilliant, she said, and completely ruthless. He closed the door behind him and came to look at what she'd laid out. You went looking. I had to know. She gestured at the files. Those men in the barn, they're not wrong about what happened. Your father did steal from them. He just did it legally. I know, Cade said. She looked at him. You've known for years. Since I was old enough to understand what I was reading. He sat heavily in the chair across from her desk. It's why I spent most of my 20s trying to leave. Why I wanted nothing to do with the ranch management. But you came back. My mother was dying. The words were simple, flat. She asked me to. Said someone needed to balance his worst impulses. His laugh was brief and without humor. I didn't manage it. He just got better at hiding things from me. Meen looked at the documents spread across the desk. What do you want to do about this? What can we do? The law's on his side. Those men in the barn are going to hang for murder, even though they were trying to defend something that should have been theirs. What if they didn't hang? The words were out before she had fully thought them through. But as she said them, she felt the shape of something beginning to form a structure, a plan, the kind of thing that emerged when you had spent enough time understanding a system's mechanics to see where it could be redirected. Cade looked at her carefully. The marshal is already on his way. I know. She pulled out a clean sheet of paper. Her mind was moving quickly now, assembling pieces. But what if we gave him a different story, not a false one, a complete one? She explained it as it took shape, the water rights documents, the pattern she'd found, the systematic legal manipulation that had driven 4 men to violence. Not as exoneration they had killed Frank, that was real and irreversible, but as context, as mitigation, as the kind of information that could change a murder charge to manslaughter, could change a death sentence to a prison term. The law doesn't care about motives, Cade said. Juries do. Public opinion does. She met his eyes. And your father cares very much about his reputation. Cade was very still. If this becomes public, Meen continued, if the full picture of how the Ashford water rights were acquired is made available to the territorial press, to the lawyers defending those men, it damages everything Gideon has built. His political connections, his plans for statehood, his legacy. She paused. I'm not suggesting we destroy him. I'm suggesting we use the threat of it to force a negotiation. You'd leverage that against him. I'd use it to save 4 men from hanging and to force him to share water access he should never have taken entirely in the first place. She leaned forward slightly. We present it as pragmatism, not morality. The territory is changing. Montana will be a state within a year or 2 at most. The old frontier methods won't work in a state with real courts and real press and real accountability. A reputation for fairness is going to be worth more than one for conquest. Cade was quiet for a long time. When I chose you, he said finally, I thought I was just making a decision my father couldn't control. He looked at her with something she was only just learning to read, something open, slightly wondering. I didn't know I was choosing someone who might actually change everything. I haven't changed anything yet. No. He came around the desk and took her hands in his. She felt the warmth of them, the roughness of his palms, the bandage on his left arm, the solid reality of his presence. But you will. His hands moved to frame her face, tilting it gently toward his. His eyes searched hers. This is dangerous, he said. If my father thinks you're trying to undermine him, I'm trying to save him from himself. From choices that will destroy everything when the territory becomes civilized enough to care about how wealth was acquired. She held his gaze. But I can't do it alone. I need you to stand with me, even if it means standing against him. I've been standing against him my whole life. Something moved in his expression, the specific quality of a decision being made. But I've never stood against him for something before. He paused. All right, we try it your way, but carefully. Then we make sure he doesn't feel cornered, she said. We make him think it's his idea. The marshal arrived 2 days later. His name was Coleman Weathered. Careful the particular quality of a man who had been administering frontier justice long enough to be skeptical of everyone's version of events. Gideon met him with the prisoners, the evidence of the attack, and Meen's documented confessions. Open and shut, Coleman said, reviewing the papers. They'll hang within a month. Perhaps? Meen spoke from the corner where she had been told to wait in case the marshal had questions about her documentation. Now she stepped forward, another file in her hands. Or perhaps there are complicating factors the court should consider. Gideon's eyes found her. The look in them was a warning and a promise simultaneously. She set the second file on the desk. I've prepared a separate report documenting the history of water rights disputes in this valley, she said, including several significant irregularities in how the Ashford claims were established. Her voice was steady, her heart was not. If this case goes to trial, these documents become part of the public record. The defense will use them to argue provocation, diminish responsibility. They will paint my father-in-law as a man who used legal manipulation to steal from desperate families. The room went very still. Coleman picked up the file, began to read. These survey markers, he said slowly. This witness testimony. If this is accurate, it's accurate, Meen said. I verified every document, cross-referenced every claim. Mr. Ashford's water rights are legal by territorial law, but they were acquired through methods that won't survive public scrutiny. You dare. Gideon started to rise. Father. Cade's voice cut across the room. Hard, commanding in a way she had never heard him use with Gideon before. Sit down. A beat. Sit down. Gideon looked at his son. Something moved between them, something old and accumulated the weight of everything that had never been said. He sat. She's right, Cade said. He moved to stand beside Meen, and the positioning of it, deliberate, unmistakable, was itself a statement. If this goes to trial, everything comes out. Your reputation, your political connections, your plans for statehood. All of it dragged through the mud while 4 men get turned into martyrs. Is that what you want? Coleman had set down the file. He was watching this family drama with the detached attention of a man who had decided to let it play out before deciding where he stood. They murdered, Gideon said. His voice was controlled, dangerous in its control. One man, Cade said, in what a good lawyer will argue was defense of property rights they believed were stolen from them. A sympathetic jury might not convict at all. And if they did the trial itself, what are you proposing? It wasn't a question. It was a demand delivered in a voice that had gone very flat. Meen had prepared for this, had spent 2 days working through the terms, testing them from every angle, looking for weaknesses. The 4 men plead guilty to manslaughter, she said. 5 years with possibility of parole. In exchange, the Ashford Ranch establishes a water cooperative with the Peterson Ranch and 2 other affected properties. Shared access to Copper Creek based on acreage and livestock need. We make restitution to Frank's family, and we fund a legal review of all water rights claims in the valley to establish clear, fair guidelines going forward. You want me to give away what I spent 20 years acquiring? I want you to share what you took, she said. There's a difference. You'll still control the largest allocation in the valley. You'll still be the most powerful rancher in the territory, but you'll also be known as someone who values stability and cooperation over conquest. She paused. That's worth something in a territory that's becoming the state. It's worth everything, Cade added quietly. When Montana gets statehood, and it will within 2 years, the men who matter will be the ones people trust, not the ones they fear. Coleman cleared his throat gently. The boy's right, he said. Times are changing. The old ways won't carry much longer. Gideon stood and moved to the window. His back was very straight, his hands clasped behind him, every line of his body, the posture of a man fighting an internal battle that no one else in the room was permitted to witness. Meen waited. She had made her calculation. She had laid out everything she had, and now there was nothing to do but hold steady and let him reach the conclusion she was trying to lead him toward without making him feel led. The silence stretched to a minute, 2. I want their guilty pleas in writing, he said finally, not turning around. His voice had gone quiet, which was different from calm. I want guarantees they'll never take action against Ashford property again. A pause. And I want this cooperative structured so that I maintain majority control. Done, Meen said immediately. And those files, oh. He turned. His eyes found hers with a directness that made her want to step back. She didn't. They disappear. The originals stay with me, she said, as insurance. But they won't be made public as long as the agreement holds. The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence, the kind that precedes an outcome, that is itself almost an outcome. Gideon Ashford looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were calculating and cold, and underneath both of those things arriving at a recognition she hadn't been certain he was capable of. You're either very brave, he said, or very foolish. Probably both, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Very small, almost invisible. Very well. He turned to Coleman. Draw up the paperwork. I'll sign whatever keeps this quiet and keeps my name clean. His eyes moved back to Meen. But if those men violate the terms, if they so much as breathe wrongly in the direction of my property, the deal is finished and they hang. Is that clear? Clear, Meen said. I'll need your help with the agreements, Coleman told her, gathering his papers. Make sure everything's documented properly. Of course, I'll have drafts ready by tomorrow. She left the study with Cade behind her. In the hallway, her legs began to shake. Cade caught her elbow and steadied her and looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. You just backed my father into a corner, he said quietly, and made him think it was his idea to cooperate. He paused. That was either the smartest or the most dangerous thing I've ever seen. Both, she managed. Definitely both. Martha was in the kitchen, expression as carefully composed as ever. He agreed to all of it, Meen told her. A pause in the bread kneading. Then Martha nodded once, decisive. You saved their lives, maybe saved this ranch from tearing itself apart. She looked at Meen. Not bad for someone who's been here a month. I haven't saved anything yet, Meen said. Still have to make it work. She sank into a chair and watched her hands tremble on the table and tried to understand what she was feeling. Not triumph. Triumph would come later. Maybe say the agreements held and the cooperative functioned and the things she had set in motion actually worked. What she felt now was something more fundamental than triumph, something closer to the first breath after a long time underwater. Cade sat beside her. His hand covered hers, warm and steady. Together, he said, whatever happens next. She looked at him, this man she had married for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. This man who had chosen her for his own complicated reasons, who had stood beside her when standing beside her cost him something, who had looked at her from the beginning as if what he found when he looked was worth seeing. Together, she said. The drafting of the agreements kept her at her desk for 3 days. She worked with Coleman on the legal language, making sure every term was clear and every contingency addressed. She had seen enough of how power manipulated ambiguity to know that vague agreements were invitations to future conflict. The water allocation formula had to be specific enough to prevent dispute. The cooperative board's authority had to be real enough to matter without being threatening enough to make Gideon refuse. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every paragraph a balance. She negotiated with Peterson's lawyer by letter, careful, precise correspondence that acknowledged the injustice of what had happened without providing anything that could be used against Gideon legally. She structured the plea agreements with Coleman with the same care, ensuring that the reduced charges would hold against any future legal challenge. And through all of it, Gideon watched. She could feel his assessment shifting as the days passed, from the hostile calculation of her first weeks through the grudging acknowledgement of her competence with the ledgers to something new and more complicated. He read her draft agreements with the focused attention of someone who had spent a lifetime making contracts and knew exactly where they could be exploited. He found 3 places where the language could be tightened and told her so, and she tightened them. He did not thank her, but he stopped watching her with hostility. That was something. Winter was coming. She could feel it in the air now. The temperature dropping at night to something that went beyond cold into another category. Entirely the mountains holding more snow on their upper ridges with each passing week. And something else was coming too. She felt it in the changed quality of Cade's attention, in the way their evening conversations had shifted what had started as information exchange Two people mapping the terrain of a shared situation had become something slower and more careful. They talked about books from Gideon's library, about things they had wanted before life taught them to want smaller things, about his mother and the ranch and the years he'd spent trying to leave it, about her mother in San Francisco and the city she could still see sometimes when she closed her eyes at the fog coming in off the bay. She noticed the way he touched her brief, ordinary contacts that had become ordinary through accumulation. His hand at her back as they moved through a doorway, his shoulder against hers when they sat together at the desk reviewing figures. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, with an expression she was learning to read. She was not prepared for how much she had come to want those things. The ordinary warmth of them. The way they filled something in her that had been empty so long, she'd stopped noticing the shape of the emptiness. She was not prepared for any of it. The night before the signing, she was in the office late going over the final language one more time when she heard Cade's door close in the room next to hers. Then silence. Then after a long moment, footsteps in the hallway. A knock at her bedroom door. Not the office door, the bedroom door. She set down her pen, crossed the office, opened the connecting door to the hallway. Cade stood there in shirt sleeves, his hair slightly disordered, his eyes uncertain in a way she had rarely seen on him. "I know we agreed," he said. His voice was quiet. "Privacy, space, time to know each other." He paused. "It's been 3 months, and I'm tired of sleeping 10 feet away from you when you're my wife." He stopped. Seemed to be finding words he wasn't certain existed. "I'm falling in love with you. I have been for weeks. I thought you should know before I—" Meen kissed him. Not to silence him, though it did that. Not because she couldn't find the words either, though she couldn't. But because his words had landed somewhere inside her that had been closed for a very long time, and the right response to that wasn't language. He kissed her back, carefully at first, then less carefully. They were still strangers in some ways. They had not had the ordinary time that people used to become known to each other, the years of small exchanges and shared meals, and the accumulated evidence of character under ordinary circumstances. What they had instead was 3 months of crisis, improving and being seen, and she had learned more about who Cade Ashford was in those 3 months than she might have learned in 3 ordinary years. When he pulled her door open and they went inside together, closing it behind them, Meen felt the difference between surviving and something else. Safe, she thought later, lying in the dark with Cade's arm around her in the Montana winter, pressing against the window. This is what safe feels like. She hadn't known she'd been waiting for it. "Tell me something," he said, his fingers tracing slow patterns on her shoulder. "That first day, when I chose you, were you terrified?" "Yes," she said. "I thought you were making a terrible mistake." "Were we—" She considered this seriously the way she considered everything. "I don't think either of us knew what we were choosing," she said. "You thought you were claiming independence. I thought I was escaping. What we actually did was save each other. From becoming people we didn't want to be," he finished. "Maybe, or maybe we're still becoming them. Just together now. I can live with that." He pressed his lips to her forehead. "Stay. No more separate rooms. Your father will notice. Let him. We're married. It's time we acted like it." She stayed. In the morning, she woke in his arms for the first time in the room that had been his mother's, with snow beginning to fall outside the window, soft and steady, covering the valley in white. She lay still and watched it and felt the particular quality of a morning that is different from other mornings that carries something new. Outside, men who had been willing to kill each other were waiting to put their names to an agreement that would give them shared access to water neither side should have had to fight over. It was not justice, it was compromise, which was uglier and more durable than justice. But it was something she had made, something that would exist because she had existed and pushed and refused to accept the options she had been given. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The signing happened on a cold November morning with frost still on the ground and breath visible in the air of the dining room. Peterson arrived with his lawyer and 2 other ranchers whose names appeared in the water rights documents. Men with the weathered, careful faces of people who had been fighting something for a long time and had stopped being certain they were winning. They sat across the table from Gideon and Cade and looked at the documents in front of them with the expression of each people examining something they wanted but didn't entirely trust. Meen sat at the end of the table. Her table, in some sense, she had drafted every document in front of them, had negotiated every term, had found the precise language that gave each side enough to feel the agreement was fair, without giving either side so much that the other would refuse. Coleman was there as witness, his weathered face carefully neutral. Peterson read the terms aloud slowly as if the words might change meaning if he moved through them too quickly. This cooperative lasts 20 years. Renegotiation every 5 years based on documented need. He looked up at Gideon. And Ashford maintains final authority on emergency water restrictions. During drought or crisis, my word stands, Gideon said. With consultation from the cooperative board, Meen said. Firm, no room for argument. The two men looked at each other across the table, years of resentment and conflict, and the specific kind of contempt that forms between people who have been fighting long enough to have stopped seeing each other as fully human. Peterson nodded slowly. Fair enough, long as we got a voice. You have a voice, Cade said. All of us do. That's the point. They signed. One by one, each man's pen moving across the paper with the careful deliberateness of people who understood the weight of what they were doing. Meen witnessed each signature, felt the accumulation of them, not triumph, she kept reminding herself. This wasn't triumph, it was compromise. It was incomplete. It was imperfect, but something real. Something that would exist in the territorial records and eventually in the state records. When Montana became a state, something that had not existed before she arrived in this house. When it was done, Peterson stood and extended his hand to Gideon across the table. Don't think this makes us friends, he said. Don't think I've forgiven what you did, but it's a start. Gideon shook it. His grip was firm, characteristic. Agreed. Now get off my property. Peterson almost smiled. It was a very small almost, but it was there. Yes, sir, but it's our creek now. Best remember that. After they left the room, settling into the particular quiet that follows conclusions, Gideon turned to Meen. You realize you just gave away a significant portion of my water rights. I helped you secure what you have left, she said, and ensure it won't be challenged for 20 years. That's not giving away. That's investment. That's semantics. That's strategy. You taught me everything is negotiable. I'm applying the lesson. Something moved in Gideon Ashford's expression. It was a small movement, barely visible. The specific expression of a man encountering something he had not expected to encounter and finding it, despite everything adequate to the situation. My son chose better than I gave him credit for, he said. It was not warmth, it was not love, it was not even approval in any ordinary sense of the word. But from Gideon Ashford, it was acknowledgement. Welcome to the family, Meen, properly this time. She inclined her head, accepting it for exactly what it was. The 4 prisoners were transferred to the territorial prison 3 days later. Louisa went to the sentencing, her eyes red but her spine straight, and when the judge handed down 5 years instead of death, Meen saw the exact moment when the tension in her face released. Not happiness, not forgiveness, but something that might eventually lead toward both if enough time passed and the world continued to turn. Justice wasn't beautiful, but it was better than vengeance. Winter came. It came the way Montana winter always came, without apology, without gradual preparation, simply arriving one morning as a complete and final fact. The temperature dropped past cold into something that had a different quality, entirely the kind of cold that was itself a form of presence. Snow buried the valley in white. Copper Creek froze along its edges. The new water cooperative agreements were tested almost immediately. A frozen well on Peterson's north pasture, a fence line that had shifted under frost, and in both cases the terms were followed. Small things, but the first evidence that the structure held. Meen spent the winter learning the ranch in ways she hadn't had time for during the crisis weeks of her arrival. Cade took her riding on clear days, showing her the property's edges, the creek systems, the high meadows, the places where the land changed character and the cattle responded differently. She learned to read weather in the quality of light on the mountains. She learned the names of the hills and which ones held snow longest and which ones the elk favored in deep winter. She was learning to belong to a place which was different from belonging to a household. She had belonged to the Hale household in the way that a tool belongs to a workshop, present useful, replaceable. This was something slower and more rooted, and she was learning Cade. Not the performance of a person, but the actual interior of one. The way he thought, the particular quality of his silences. What made him laugh? What made him go quiet in a way that meant he was working through something difficult? She learned the story of his mother in increments, the way you learn painful things a little at a time until the full shape of it was visible. She learned his relationship with his father, the complicated, unresolved thing. It was love and resentment and respect and the specific grief of a son who could see his father clearly and still not be able to stop caring what he thought. She told him about her mother in return, about San Francisco and the smell of the bay and the particular light through the window of their two-room apartment above the seamstress shop. About the letter in the wooden box, she translated it for him one winter evening. Sitting close together by the study fire, her voice steady through most of it and less steady toward the end, where her mother had written about what she wanted for her daughter. "I want her to be seen," her mother had written. "Not my daughter, not a Chinese girl, not a body doing work. I want someone to look at her and see the person who was there." Cade had listened to the translation in silence. Then he had taken her hand without saying anything, which was the right response. By February, she had stopped waking up, wondering if she was still welcome. It happened gradually enough that she only noticed it after the fact, the way you only notice you have stopped hurting when you realize the hurt is gone. She was with some caution and considerable qualifications, and an awareness that nothing was permanent beginning to be at home. The letter came from the Hale Ranch in August. She was in the kitchen garden with Louisa harvesting the late tomatoes when Martha called her to the house. The rider waiting in the yard was young and dusty and had the face of someone carrying news he hadn't asked to carry. "Mrs. Ashford," he pulled a letter from his coat, "from your sister. She says it's urgent." Meen opened it there in the yard. Gerald Hale had been hurt in a wagon accident, a wheel giving way on a hill road, the wagon rolling the internal injuries that the doctor said couldn't be repaired. He was asking for her. She read it twice, looked up. Cade was on the porch. "I'll go," she said, "if you'll come with me." "Of course," he said. "Give me 20 minutes." The ride to the Hale Ranch took half a day, and with every mile, Meen felt the particular quality of returning to a place you have left, the way it is smaller than you remembered, the way your body knows the distance and the landmarks before your conscious mind catches up. The ranch looked worse than she remembered, the fences lower, the paint further gone, the garden entirely reclaimed by weeds. Constance met them at the door with the exhausted face of someone who had been keeping vigil. "He's upstairs," she said. "The doctor says it's only a matter of time." Elena was at the bedside, her face blotchy and tired, her resentment visible but subdued beneath something more urgent. She looked at Meen when she came in with an expression that held several years of emotions in complicated layers. "He's been asking for you since yesterday," she said quietly. Gerald Hale looked very small against the pillows. The size of a man had always been partly the authority he projected, and now that the authority was gone, diminished by pain, and the approach of something that rendered all human authority irrelevant, he was just a man and not a large one. His eyes opened when Meen drew near, struggled to focus. "Meen," her name in his mouth uncertain and thin. "I'm here," she said. "I was wrong." His hand fumbled toward her. She took it at the hand that had gripped her arm, hard enough to bruise on the day of her wedding, the hand that had spent 12 years gesturing her toward corners and away from conversations. It was just a hand now, small and cold and trembling. "About you, about everything. You don't have to. You were her daughter." He coughed, and what came up was dark. I should have treated you like my own. I was a coward. You reminded me of her, of what I'd lost." His eyes closed. "You deserve better. I'm sorry for all of it." The apology was too late and too small and entirely inadequate for 12 years. She knew that. She also knew that it was all he had left to give. "I forgive you," she said. She said it and found to her genuine surprise that she meant it. Not because what he had done was forgivable in any accounting sense, not because she was required to mean it, but because carrying unforgiveness was its own kind of cage, and she was done with cages. He died an hour later. Elena's hand on one side of his, Meen's on the other. Whatever he had been weak, calculating, capable of small cruelties and smaller shipwreck kindnesses, he had also been a man who had spent his whole life afraid of failing and had failed anyway. There was tragedy in that. She let herself acknowledge the tragedy without resolving it into something tidier. The funeral was small. Meen paid for it, the simple coffin, the plot, the modest meal for the few neighbors who came. Cade stood beside her throughout, solid and present, in the ways she had come to rely on without entirely having meant to. Afterward, in the empty Hale house that smelled of dust and old decisions, Elena sat across from her in the parlor. I hated you, Elena said, direct, for months, for taking what should have been mine, for ruining everything. I know. But watching him die, she stopped, started again, seeing how he looked when he talked about you, how he looked when he said he'd failed. She pressed her hands together in her lap. Maybe I was wrong about what was taken from me, about what I deserved. We both deserve better, Meen said, than being bartered away to save a failing ranch. A silence. What happens to me now? Elena asked. Constance is going back east. I have nothing, no money, no. Come stay with us, Meen said. Elena blinked. At the Ashford ranch. There's room. There's work you'd be good at. You always had a talent for organization. We'll find you a place. After everything, we're sisters, Meen said. That should mean something. She extended her hand across the space between them. So yes, come. Elena looked at her hand for a long moment, at the calluses and the evidence of work, at the hand extended in genuine offer, and then took it, and held it. And for the first time since childhood, they were connected by choice rather than circumstance. Elena arrived at the Ashford ranch the following week. Gideon raised an eyebrow when the wagon appeared in the yard. He said nothing. Martha assessed Elena with the same focus and attention she applied to everything, set her up in a small room, put her to work in the kitchen, and watched. Within a month, it was clear that Elena had a genuine talent for household organization, the kind of systematic, detail-oriented management that freed Martha for the more complex work of running a large ranch household. Within 2 months, Thomas Beckett started finding reasons to be in the kitchen considerably more often than ranch business required, watching them circle each other with the elaborate, awkward courtesy of people who didn't yet know what they wanted to admit. Meen felt something she recognized as uncomplicated happiness. Both Hale daughters, she thought, both finding their way here. Maybe that was what Cade's choice that September afternoon had actually been making possible, not just her escape, but the beginning of something larger than either of them had imagined. In October, Gideon returned from Helena with news. Montana would be a state within the year. The Constitutional Convention had begun, and Gideon had been asked to advise on water rights legislation for the new state constitution. He told them at supper, and then he looked directly at Meen. They want someone who understands the practical implementation of cooperative water systems, he said. Someone with actual experience making these agreements function. I told them I had exactly the person if she was willing. The table was quiet. Meen set down her fork. You want me to help write state law? I want you to make sure those water cooperative agreements you forced me into become the template for the entire state. His expression was almost amused. Might as well make my surrender into everyone else's policy. A pause. Besides, you're better at this than I ever was. Time I admitted it. It was the closest Gideon Ashford had ever come to saying he'd been wrong. Meen received it for what it was. I'll do it, she said, on one condition. Of course there's a condition. We establish a fund for the families of men killed in water disputes, starting with Frank's family. Enough to provide for them properly. And we make it ongoing so no family ever has to choose between legal fees and feeding their children. Gideon studied her. The calculation in his eyes was visible and not unkind. That will cost money, he said. The ranch can afford it, and it's the right thing to do. A pause. Long enough that she felt the weight of it. Draft the proposal, he said. I'll present it to the legislature. She went to Helena 3 times that winter. Each time was its own form of battle rooms full of men who had very clear ideas about who should be shaping territorial law and who should not, who had never expected to have their arguments challenged by a Chinese woman with a ledger and an unshakable command of the specific mechanics of water allocation. She testified before committees. She debated lawyers who had been practicing longer than she'd been alive. She answered questions about her background and her authority and the basis for her opinions with the calm, undefensive precision of someone who had learned long ago that the most effective response to dismissal was competence. She won the arguments, one at a time, through the specific and unrepeatable power of being right. By spring, when the Montana Constitution was ratified and the territory became a state water cooperative, agreements were written into state law. Every major waterway would be managed through shared access boards. Disputes would be mediated before they escalated to violence. A fund, the Frank Morrison Fund, named for the man who had died in the line camp, would support families harmed in the transition from frontier chaos to something that resembled governance. It was not perfect justice. It did not undo what Gideon had done. It did not restore to Peterson and the others what had been taken from them in the years before she arrived. But it prevented future taking, and in the long work of making the world incrementally better that mattered. The night Montana officially became a state, Meen stood on the porch of the Ashford Ranch. The valley was spread out below her in the spring dark, Copper Creek glinting in the moonlight, the distant ranch compound lights of people she now knew by name, the mountains against the sky. A year and a half ago, she had never seen this valley. 6 months ago, she had been standing in a corner of a failing ranch house, waiting to be invisible. Cade came to stand beside her, his arms settled around her waist with the ease of something that had been practiced enough to become natural. She leaned against him slightly, feeling his warmth. "What are you thinking?" when he asked. "That a year and a half ago I was standing in my father's house, expecting nothing," she said. "Wanting nothing, invisible to everyone in the room." She could feel him listening, the particular quality of his attention, the way he gave her his full presence rather than half of it. "And now I've helped write state law," she said, "changed how an entire state manages water. Made men in that legislature listen to me when they didn't want to. Made your father admit he was wrong." She paused. "Made you fall in love with me." "I think that last one was the least of your achievements," he said, "given how easy it turned out to be." She turned in his arms to face him, looked at this man she had married for survival and had loved into something much larger. "I love you," she said. "It took me a while to say it, but I do." He kissed her forehead, her temple, the corner of her eye. The particular tenderness of it was something she had stopped being surprised by, which was itself a form of belonging. "I know," he said, "you show me every day." Behind them, the house blazed with light. Martha and Louisa in the kitchen, voices audible through the window. Elena and Thomas in the parlor, talking in the low, careful way of people who were still learning what they were to each other. Gideon in his study reviewing documents that Meen would check tomorrow. The same work, the same careful accounting, but different now that she understood what it was in service of and had some power over the direction it went. The Ashford Ranch, built on conquest and maintained through ruthlessness, was slowly and perfectly becoming something better. Not innocent, not redeemed in any simple sense, but moving inch by careful inch toward a version of itself that she could be part of without pretending she didn't know what she was part of. That was the work. That was what she had chosen. She turned back to the valley. The state of Montana stretched beyond it in every direction. 40,000 square miles of land and water and human struggle, and the specific ongoing difficulty of building something that deserved to exist. She had started as the daughter no one wanted, the woman expected to stand in corners and make herself small and ask for nothing. She had become the person who helped write the rules. Not because she had been rescued, not because someone had handed her a future, but because she had refused at every point where it would have been easier to stop, when Gerald had dismissed her with 8 words, when Elena had called her nobody, when Gideon had moved around his desk to use his size to silence her, when the weight of complicity had pressed down in the dark by the horse corral. She had refused to disappear. That refusal, that single stubborn, repeated refusal, that was what had changed everything. She was Meen Ashford, wife, accountant, mediator, lawmaker, the Chinese woman who had walked into an empire built on conquest and had slowly, carefully, at considerable personal cost, begun the work of making it mean something better. And her story was just beginning.